This story begins with an introduction stating that the pure yang technique was the strongest of the time. Learning its basics made one practically invincible and thus capable of facing countless opponents. Mastering it made one truly invincible in that world. However, the path to learning that technique was extremely difficult because it not only required an understanding of the fundamental substances of the universe's roots, but also an innate sword body, which was absolutely necessary to master the art. That was because after thousands of years, no one except for the technique's founder, the matriarch of Meichuan, had been able to learn even the basics of it. However, even so, there was one more person, the protagonist. His name was Yi, and he was the only person in the world capable of practicing pure yang, which made him the current master of Muxian. A master like him had reached that status at a young age. Moreover, his cultivation was the strongest that existed. His sect was also the best of all, possessing the most powerful collection of magical treasures. For that reason, he was worthy of being the strongest on the continent and first in everything. Theoretically, he should have been considered invincible in that world. However, there were still some complications. Immediately after, the scene cuts the protagonist thinking that he should be able to escape if he fled to the void of the universe's temporal regions. Looking to the side, the boy suddenly comes across an unknown person who is seemingly holding a talisman. At that moment, she begins chanting an incantation. Soon after, that woman opens her eyes and starts activating her magic. She casts it towards the ground, seemingly in the direction of the protagonist. Observing the magic, he wonders if that was the 5 thunder purification. Immediately after, he is struck by the attack. And on that day, the main peak of Long Mountain was completely destroyed. Yet, in turn, states that a single attack was enough to destroy the hui of the immortal swords that protected his body, and for that reason, he affirms that the technique was extremely powerful. At that moment, another person appears at the scene. His name was Fai Hong. He thinks that she was using sheer brute force to reach that altitude, which made her demonic techniques truly incredible. Shortly after, the protagonist asks if the girl wanted something from him. Hong makes a hand sign and immediately starts chanting an incantation while advancing toward the protagonist. Soon after, he collapses to the ground and states that now his protective mantle had also been completely destroyed. At that moment, another girl appears at the scene. Her name was Yun. She calls the protagonist brother and asks if he was alright. The boy replies that he was, and Yun says that everything was fine as long as he wasn't hurt. Shortly after, she touches the protagonist and seemingly begins chanting an incantation. At that moment, he feels something and thinks that the sealing spell had become even stronger. Yun then states that in that way, the boy would not be able to escape. Another girl appears, asking them to wait a moment as she believed that the seal would not be enough to contain him. Then, Yuzu starts chanting an incantation, casting it toward Yi. Immediately, he feels something and wonders if that was the mortal executor's dispersion, questioning why Yuzu had done that. Another girl appears, stating that she might have even poisoned Yi, but even so would not be enough, because in that way he could still manage to control the poison using his magic. Yi says that Bai was no fool either. At that moment, Bai points her finger at Yi and starts chanting another incantation. Yi looks up the sky and a glow begins to emerge from between the clouds. Then several swords descend towards the boy and strike him shortly after, and the incantation was completed. Yi states that this was the draconic assassin's sword formation and questions if he wasn't the one who had taught that trick to the girl. The protagonist was the only person in the world capable of using pure yang, and for that reason, he was a master who had entered the realm of the gods at an extremely young age. In the cultivation of sex and magical treasures, he was number 1. Theoretically, he should have been considered invincible in that place. However, he knew that he could not afford to be defeated. Even so, 5 people stronger than him had joined forces to defeat him, and for that reason, he was unable to retaliate. In the midst of that situation, he questions what was happening and whether they were suddenly attacking him just to defeat him. He asks if that was their way of organizing a meeting to discuss martial arts because if that were the case, he would not be able to teach them. Soon after, all 5 of them call the protagonist and ask which one of them he liked the most. The boy is very confused by what he hears, wondering if he was not about to be killed at that moment. As one could see, the protagonist was in that situation, and now to understand it better, he would have to explain more about pure yang. He had previously stated that it made a person invincible in that world. However, there was a major drawback. At that moment, another man appears saying that since things had already reached that point, there were some important things they needed to discuss, because those who practice pure yang cannot have relationships with women and vice versa. Otherwise, the side effects would be intense, such as vomiting blood and even suffering severe convulsions in the worst cases. And because of that, death was absolutely certain. The protagonist then becomes very irritated, asking why the man had not told him that earlier, as he no longer wanted that ability. However, the other elder states that if he tried to dissipate that ability, he would end up exploding and dying, which makes Yi even more furious at what he had just learned, wondering how such a powerful skill could come with such a massive drawback. And to make matters even worse, his incredible talent and his body were also exceptional. so it would be absolutely ridiculous not to take advantage of the opportunity to get closer to the people of that world. However, every time he was about to do something with the other girls, he could never understand what was happening, as he always felt sick. And because of that, he hated it, since all the good relationships he had with women would have to be left behind. Thus, he was forced to suppress his instincts until the last day of his life, and for that reason, he would always be doomed to remain a virgin forever. However, due to the seal he had placed on his powers over the past 3 years, all the women with whom he had built strong relationships simply did not want to leave. In the midst of that situation, he asked them to be reasonable, stating that they should be learning martial arts, improving their cultivation bases, or even building their own sex. For that reason, mundane relationships between men and women made no sense, and he questions why they were taking it so seriously. However, another girl responds that she had never been as serious about anything in her life as she was about her love for him. Another one responds that they had known each other since childhood, questioning why he was doing this to her now. And the other then says that at that moment, the protagonist needed to be a man. In the midst of that situation, he wonders how he could resolve it because obviously he desired all of them. But if they all attacked him, he would definitely end up dead. And for that reason, he was still contemplating choosing only one person. However, if he did that, the other 4 would surround him and then kill him, so he had no choice. Because of that, he would have to reject all of them. But if he did that, it would not solve anything either. Soon after, Bai says that he had to give them an answer, so it was better not to even try to stall. Yuzu states that his divine key swords had been destroyed, his defensive hobby was gone as well, and after that, there was still that powerful spell. And because of that, with a sword above his head and poison in his body, he had no other way out. In the midst of that situation, Yi thinks that they were right because even with his unparalleled invincibility, he had nowhere to go. However, there was still something he could do. Soon after, the protagonist calls the 5 and asks if they really thought they could defeat the master with just the techniques he had taught them. At that moment, Yi looks up, and the 5 of them are then very surprised, because out of nowhere, an enchantment begins to descend from the sky, where the protagonist is seemingly managing to free himself from all those spells. Thinking that in that situation, where the 5 strongest people had left him with no way out, he had no choice but to do that. At that moment, he was about to ascend to the heavens, thinking that he had already reached the peak of his immortal stage long ago and never thought he would ascend in that way. And during his life as immortal, he had gained the power to rule the heavens. After that great spectacle, he wonders if he could say that his life had been worth it, because he had fought to make his sect number 1 through merit alone. Thus, he ended up becoming an enemy of the world after saving countless lives within the demonic sect, managing to suppress even great elders and killing their powerful ancient beings. Moreover, he had reached the peak of perfection in various regions. However, even if he could deceive everyone, he could not deceive himself, for the achievements he had accumulated, along with the many challenges he had overcome, could not compare to the regret and emptiness he felt in his heart, because he truly wished to lose his virginity. In the midst of that situation, Yi wonders what he could do now that he had ascended, because if he had a second chance, he would never practice pure yang again. Soon after, the boy remembers all of his companions, stating that they were very cute when they weren't trying to kill him. At that moment, he suddenly senses 5 celestial tribulations. However, none of them seem to be directed at him. The boy looks back. He is very surprised by what he sees because all the others were also ascending. He then becomes extremely desperate at what he had witnessed. Time passes and the scene shifts to another location. In a cabin, he awakens. Looking around, the boy wonders what is happening and thinks that he has never seen that style of architecture before. He assumes he is in an immortal world. Additionally, it seems that his abilities have disappeared from his body, and because of that, ascension to immortality had forced him to start over from scratch. Soon after, the boy looks to the side and comes across a beautiful woman. He is very surprised, but still wants to understand what is happening. Observing the girl, he thinks that she is extremely beautiful. Such a stunning fairy should belong to the transcendent world. That immortal world was an extraordinary place, and it was no surprise that everyone sought Tao enlightenment to ascend. However, even so, it was a shame because despite all those beautiful women, he had practiced pure yang and could not engage in romantic relationships with them. But at that moment, the protagonist realizes something, stating that he no longer has that ability, and because of that, he is now free to do whatever he wants. But then he remembers something. He was a modest knight and could not be impulsive, so he needed to get to know himself better first. They would unite among flowers and moonlight and then agree to do many things together. Soon after, the girl awakens and realizes what the protagonist is doing. Quickly, the boy tries to explain himself. However, it is already too late. Time passes and the scene shifts to several elves watching the protagonist, who's up in a tree. Another girl asks how he dares to sneak into her room. However, another girl intervenes saying that the protagonist is extremely handsome and because of that, they should just let him go. Ye, observing all those people, is very surprised, stating that this place was definitely the immortal world. Soon after, another girl appears and asks what is happening, wanting to know what was causing so much noise. It is revealed that she is the village leader, who then asks Luna about the problem. Luna responds that there was a man who had sneaked into her room and watched her while she slept. The leader becomes irritated and says that such audacity deserved punishment. But at that moment, the leader looks at the protagonist and realizes that the boy is extremely handsome, asking if he was truly a bad man because there was no such thing as such a handsome orc. She assumes that he might be a lost traveler and therefore should rest in her room. The leader approaches Luna and asks if the protagonist had done anything to her, and Luna responds that he had not, stating that he merely stood near her bed without looking at her. Soon after, the man says that it was just a misunderstanding because he had an eye condition that forced him to stare at people. Therefore, he had done nothing to offend anyone. The leader then asks the other elves what they think, and they all agree that the protagonist is innocent. She responds that their opinion is reasonable, so she agrees with them, concluding that he was merely a poor traveler. Therefore, you should be taken to the leader's room now. The scene shifts to the protagonist in the leader's room, where she apologizes for the villagers' behavior and wants to compensate him. He says that since he arrived, he has wanted to better connect with the villagers, especially in learning about their culture and customs. The leader says that he is very honest and never imagined that he had such a dirty mind. Since he was fine with an older woman, she would grant his request. She begins to approach Ye, but at that moment, Luna appears, irritated by what she is seeing. The leader asks what the problem is. Luna says that the scouts have reported that orcs have been spotted moving quickly and would reach the village in 3 days. Soon after, the protagonist is grabbed by the collar of his shirt, and the girl starts hitting him, saying that he must hurry and prepare the defenses. The leader understands the situation, but wants to know why Luna hit Ye. Luna responds that she suspected he might be a spy for the orcs. However, the leader replies that it was impossible because he was far too handsome to be involved with them. In the midst of that situation, Luna admits that she might really be wrong. Thus, the leader asks her to stop beating the boy, who, meanwhile, is on the ground in tears, wondering what he had done wrong. Luna then asks if it would be better to request reinforcements from the city. However, the leader responds that it is already too late for that. Luna questions what else they could do then. The leader says that since they had reached that point, the only thing they could do was that. And at that moment, she approaches the protagonist, stating that she would like to ask for his help on behalf of the village. For that reason, they should assist in defeating their #1 natural enemy, which in truth were the orcs. A long time ago, mysterious and noble gods were common in that world, and because of that, the moon goddess and the earth goddess were great friends. They walked through the forest every day with their joyful and harmonious relationship, spending days and nights having fun, until everything came to an end that day. Another girl then asks how the noble earth goddess could throw used cucumbers on the ground as if they were nothing. However, the other woman replies that she thought she was a graceful and perfect goddess, questioning why she was accusing others like a demon. The other girl says that joke is not funny at all because she always lies about such irrelevant things, being the earth goddess. Thus, an argument between the two breaks out, and that is how the two goddesses, who were once so close, turned against each other, igniting a battle of the gods which burned in fury for many days and nights. In the end, they could not reconcile, and to put an end to it, they decided to separate. After that, many years passed, and since then, as you must have realized, the elves are descendants of the moon goddess, while those bastard orcs are descendants of the earth goddess. After hearing all that, the protagonist says he is starting to understand. However, he still does not see why his help is important. The leader then responds that elves are constantly harassed by orcs, and that should be their fatal weakness. When facing orcs, their legs grow weak and their faces flush, so they lose the will to resist. Observing that situation, Yi says he thinks he now understands everything about that legend. And now that he knew their weakness, he felt it made sense considering the orcs' origin. However, he still wanted to know why they liked him even before he arrived in that place. So the leader responds that it was because of a prophecy, which was mentioned in the book of the gracious final prophecy of a foreign traveler who would emerge between the two peaks and appear to cleanse the impurity of their race. But unfortunately, in the end, the impotent pillar would also be toppled. And according to the calendar, it was the right time, so the person mentioned in the prophecy was probably Yi. Soon after, they ask what the boy thinks, as they would definitely not lie to him since they had seen what the book said. Then Luna begins to examine the book, saying that the ink of the letters was still fresh, so she suspected that the leader had just written it. However, the leader says that was impossible because it was the gracious final prophecy, which had been passed down from generation to generation within their clan. Then Luna begins to read, questioning what all those strange writings were. However, at that moment, the leader immediately intervenes, stating that she should stop reading because she was not the one who wrote that. In the midst of that situation, Yi thinks he has no idea what is happening in the immortal world. At that moment, he observes everything, wondering if finding that village had been mere coincidence. These kinds of encounters, known for being random, are connected to many incredible events throughout his journey of immortal cultivation that had a high reward rate, offering unique opportunities to improve one's cultivation. And for that reason, the protagonist was already used to such encounters. Thus, that task could provide various opportunities for him to enhance his skills, and because of that, he decided to accept the offer. Then the leader thanks the protagonist, stating that she knew he was a noble person. Additionally, they would pay him 100,000 gold coins. However, the boy says that he does not need that because he is not a hero seeking fame or fortune. Hearing what the boy had said, the leader asks what he thinks about receiving 3 beautiful elves to serve him as maids. Yi then becomes very excited, saying that she should send one to his room that night as an advance payment or even send her right away. Soon after, Luna ends up hitting the protagonist on the head, and he then says that they should deal with those trivial matters later. But at that moment, he says that he needs a little time alone. The scene then cuts to Yi in a bathroom, thinking that the place is very refined, and for that reason, he should see what he still has at that moment. At that moment, Yi begins to meditate, realizing that, as he had confirmed before, his cultivation base had completely disappeared, and he could forget about magical weapons for now since his body could not withstand them. But at that moment, Yi is very surprised to discover that he still possesses some magical weapons. However, even so, it still does not matter. Nonetheless, that did not matter because, with those magical weapons in his arsenal, he would be able to conquer the world. For that reason, that space would determine his place in the immortal world. Moreover, it seemed that he was truly destined for the top always, and with that momentum, he would be able to become the best of all. But at that moment, something unexpected happens as only low-quality relics appear. Leaving Yi very disappointed with what he saw, he wonders what happened to his divine swords and irreplaceable treasures, supposing that it was probably a seal from the realm, and in addition, he wonders how that could be possible, thinking he must have done something wrong just now. Soon after, the boy performs the incantation again. However, he only obtains the same relics as before, becoming very irritated because he is so weak that he cannot access any of his immortal treasures. At that moment, another elf seems to be approaching the place. Meanwhile, the protagonist begins to observe the girl. He quickly notices her presence. Soon after, he takes her hand. Then it is revealed that it was Luna. He says that she had acted so refined with the village chief, but now she was trying to watch him while he was doing his business. Luna says that it was not like that, and that she was just passing by. Yi, irritated, asks if her head had fallen into the window while she was passing. Luna replies that she only wanted to check if he was an orc spy. At that moment, the elven leader arrives at the scene, asking what all the commotion is about. He says that she should have even seen his 2 treasures. The leader, hearing what the protagonist said, is very surprised. Yi says that it was not that kind of treasure, and that she was just thinking nonsense. Quickly, the leader approaches the protagonist, saying that she should examine his body. Time passes, and the scene cuts to the next day. The protagonist asks if those are the village's strongest fighters. The leader says yes, that they are the village's powerful archers, especially skilled in shooting. Yi, observing the situation, says that it should work as long as they remember the signal positions. For that reason, they should follow his instructions. Since they were good at shooting, he assumes that they could create a combat plan based on that. Yi begins to strategize, explaining to all the elves. He even starts teaching some attack techniques. Meanwhile, the boy takes the opportunity to get closer to the other elves. However, Luna constantly interferes in the situation to rescue the girls. After all those instructions, Yi says that most of them had an aptitude for archery, and for that reason, there should be no issues. He thought that some of the girls were not positioned correctly. For that reason, they should go to his room at that moment, as he would help them individually. Soon after, 2 elves appear, asking to go first. Yi, very excited, says that he thought the 2 were progressing well, but they had not yet reached their goal, and for that reason, they should go to his room so he could teach them personally. At that moment, Luna appears at the scene, starting to chase the protagonist. He then looks to the side, and at that moment, an elf appears, saying that the orcs were already there. The leader becomes very nervous, stating that they are a day ahead of schedule. Soon after, the scene cuts to another location, where an elf appears to be in distress. In front of her, an orc emerges. The girl tries to attack the orc, but it has no effect. Desperate, she begins to beg for her life. The orc quickly grabs his weapon, and after that, only the sound of it is heard. Time passes, and a great war begins in the village. Another orc says not to be too hasty because they did not want the elves to get hurt. For that reason, they should capture all the ones they saw and wait to take them back together. Another elf, desperate, pleads for them to stop wasting time. The other orc then says they should line up and afterward head to another location. One of the orcs starts speaking, saying that he is the 9th prince of the orc clans and that it is in their nature to be subjugated by them. For that reason, they should kneel immediately. Meanwhile, the elves are extremely desperate, and at that moment, the protagonist appears. He tells them to remember not to hit any innocents in the crossfire. The other elves then begin firing their bows, managing to land precise shots to the orcs' heads. However, the prince manages to catch an arrow, looking very surprised at what he sees, wondering if they had reinforcements. Once again, he asks them to follow his previous instructions and concentrate their attacks on the leader. Soon after, the elves start aiming their arrows and initiate a sequence of attacks directed at the prince. However, none of them have any effect. The orc prince is very surprised and asks if they had a commander. The elven leader, observing the situation, questions whether those arrows would really work. He responds that eventually they would, and for that reason, she should trust him. At that moment, one of the arrows strikes the orc. Meanwhile, a girl appears to be casting an incantation. Thus, several arrows start hitting the orc. Observing the situation, he thinks that he knew it would work. Using the arrows like flying swords to successfully create a sword formation was brilliant. Moreover, it was a great variety of immortal swords. From that moment on, he would be rising back to the top. Meanwhile, the orc prince screams in pain, stating that this was very interesting. At that moment, he removes all the arrows from his back, mentioning that he never would have imagined that a village like this would cause him so much trouble. But since things had come this far, they would see if they could handle what was coming. At that moment, the orc grabs a kind of relic, which appears to have a different effect on the orcs. Then the orcs become unable to stand. The leader is very surprised and states that he had brought the orcs sacred treasure, and no elf could resist that power. The orc prince responds that all of them are subject to Zul's will, and it so happened that on his way there, his father had asked him to transport the sacred artifact, and for that reason, it was terrible luck for them. At that moment, the leader states that she will not let that happen. The villagers had always believed in her, and for that reason, she would not allow the orc to win. Soon after, the girl appears and starts casting an incantation, stating that this is the only thing they can do with their strength. At that moment, they begin casting a spell, summoning a kind of fireball and declaring that she would not let him lay a finger on her companions. The orc prince is very surprised, stating that this was a level 6 attack and moreover, wondering how such a remote village could have such a powerful mage. But at that moment, the orc says he was just joking, mentioning that if it weren't for him being there, the elves might have been able to resist. However, they should feel ashamed because it was him they were facing, as the orc prince was actually a great master. At that moment, the orc strikes at the girl's magic, which is instantly dispelled. Meanwhile, another elf is in tears, apologizing on behalf of all her companions. But at that moment, the protagonist appears to save her, stating that she had fought fiercely, and for that reason, it was something truly wonderful and unforgettable. In the midst of that situation, the elf tells him to take that chance to escape. But he asks about the reward she had promised earlier, questioning if she would still gift him 3 maids. Hearing what the boy had said, the leader is very surprised. Soon after, he asks them to leave the rest to him. Looking back, the orc finds himself facing the protagonist, asking who had brought that weak human there. The boy then introduces himself, saying that his name is Yi, and the orc comments that the protagonist is a tall and handsome man, and for that reason, a single strike would be enough to send him to the afterlife. Yi then begins to explain that he used to be at the top of the world, and because of that, he should have been experiencing the kind of beauty and pleasures that came with it. But unfortunately, that was impossible back then. Now, however, he had 3 maids and a leader sister waiting for him, asking if the orc really thought he would let all of that be taken away from him. Hearing that entire speech, the orc prince becomes very irritated, saying that Yi should prove his strength to him. At that moment, the protagonist simply makes a hand gesture, easily blocking the orc's attack, who then asks if that was all the strength he had. Observing the situation, the orc is very surprised, wondering how that was possible. Meanwhile, the elven leader watches everything, realizing that the protagonist had nullified a level 6 spell. At the same time, the protagonist is apparently holding a kind of talisman capable of preventing any attack up to the nascent soul stage. At that moment, the paper tears and he quickly summons the portal from before, stating that now it was his turn to attack. Immediately after, he picks up that small artifact from earlier. The orc then questions whether that was by any chance a wooden sword. Ye in turn says that he could tell the orc was not above the nascent soul stage, and for that reason, he would be easily defeated. At that moment, the protagonist strikes the orc, who is then easily defeated. He then falls to the ground. Observing the situation, the leader is very surprised, stating that the great orc prince had been taken down with a single blow. Looking at the object in his hand, Yi thinks that this was not actually the sacred sword, but just an ordinary wooden one. And since he could not recover a high-grade sword, this was a truly common sword. However, it was slightly distinct from the usual mediocre ones, because in a test a few years ago, he had faced the celestial master Lu, and to add to her humiliation, he deliberately chose one of the most ordinary wooden swords. Thus, he ended up using her refining technique to truly receive her message, and after all that, the protagonist ended up winning that battle. Observing the situation, the girl became very irritated. Another elder states that the strike from an ordinary sword gains another point. However, the protagonist was an unmatched person in refining that technique. And although it still appeared to be an ordinary wooden sword, its attack power actually placed it above an average immortal sword. For that reason, that sword deserved to be called a 99 times refined common grade Marigrain, the wooden sword that conquered everything up to the nascent soul stage. Remembering his past, the protagonist thinks that he had only done that out of arrogance and never thought that this sword would become so useful to him. However, a common grade sword was still a common grade sword, and for that reason, he could not keep it in use for long. At that moment, an elf appears, asking if everything was already over. Noticing that Luna was there, he straightens himself up and confidently states that the orc prince was too weak. And now that the mission was finally over, he could ask the village chief about his reward. Then the boy approaches Luna, asking if by any chance she would like to be one of his rewards. At that moment, the girl notices something. Then it is revealed that the orc was still alive, because after suffering fatal damage, an orc would go insane with fury for a short period. Observing the situation, the protagonist is very surprised, realizing that he had been too careless. Immediately after, the orc starts swinging an axe toward the boy. Yi then pushes Luna aside, thinking that even if he could not avoid the attack, he at least had to save the girl. He had barely known her, but even so, he felt that he needed to save her because that girl, in reality, always reminded him of someone. At that moment, Luna begins speaking, stating that he was an idiot. Then the girl makes a hand gesture, and in a matter of seconds, a bolt of lightning descends from the sky, striking the orc prince directly, who is then disintegrated. Meanwhile, the protagonist watches everything, and soon after, he looks at Luna again, noticing that her hair is beginning to change color, and even her clothes are changing. Then it is revealed that in reality, she was Xiaoyu, who then begins approaching the protagonist, stating that she was not actually trying to save him. Realizing that it was the girl, Yi is very surprised, remembering that those girls had actually ascended at that very moment before. Meanwhile, Xiaoyu starts observing the protagonist, saying that she had heard that all of his cultivation had disappeared. Then, Xiaoyu approaches Yi, saying that her master was so powerful that he could ascend to the heavens even while surrounded by all 5 of them, and for that reason being in an immortal world with him made her very happy. Meanwhile, the protagonist was feeling very discouraged, saying that it really didn't feel right. Observing this, the girl becomes very frustrated and soon begins to unleash multiple lightning strikes in that area. She starts talking about all the times the protagonist had invited multiple elves to his room. Ye, extremely exhausted, asks the girl to stop. He questions how she could still have those cultivation abilities and for that reason, wants to know what her current realm is. Xiaoyu then becomes very irritated, asking if he still dared to point his finger at her. Thus, time passes again and the scene cuts to the protagonist asking if he had been there for 3 months. Xiaoyu then responds that she had only awakened at the core formation stage. Observing the situation, Yi questions whether she had changed her appearance using that ability from before. Xiaoyu then responds that she had done all of that along with another ability to rewrite her consciousness. Yi says that in this world, a dream serves as a butterfly and the butterfly becomes like a dream. And for that reason, she used the technique to create a seal that hid her main consciousness, making her truly believe she was an elf. He then questions what condition needed to be met for the seal to be broken. Xiaoyu in turn responds that it would happen by encountering true danger or even meeting another cultivator. Observing the situation, the protagonist says that if that were the case, it would have been when she met him for the first time. After that whole conversation, the two end up leaving the cabin. Then it is revealed that the leader was there, saying that ever since Luna had arrived in the village 3 months ago, she had felt that things wouldn't be so simple. Xiaoyu then thanks the village chief and the inhabitants for taking care of her all this time. However, the leader responds that, in reality, they should be thanking her for helping to repel all the orcs. She mentions that foreign travelers came to cleanse the impurities surrounding their race, just as the prophecy had foretold. Xiaoyu, in turn, asks for that to remain a secret, stating that they would be leaving the next day. But at that moment, he suddenly remembers something, saying that it was something he could not forget. He mentions that he hadn't searched for the treasures after fighting that orc. Soon after, the protagonist arrives at the site of the previous battle, feeling very frustrated with what he sees, as he finds only a pile of charcoal in that place. Because of that, all the equipment he had, along with all of his abilities, was gone. But at that moment, the protagonist notices something in the midst of all the darkness. Then he starts searching through it, but he becomes very sad with what he sees, because it was simply something he did not want to see, and it even had a second part. Yi then becomes very irritated, asking what it was and how it had been left behind. Soon after, the boy steps on something again, realizing that the relic belonging to that guy from before had also remained, and for that reason, it could allow him to do many things. Soon after, Xiaoyu appears at the scene. The protagonist quickly hides that relic, claiming that everything was the girl's fault as everything had been destroyed because of her lightning. Then he approaches the elven leader, showing her that relic from before. And at that moment, the elf seemingly begins to feel something. The protagonist, in turn, is very pleased, stating that it was truly very useful. Thus, time passes again, and he is apparently already leaving the village alongside Xiaoyu. Meanwhile, all the elves seem to be very sad about what they were witnessing. Soon after, the protagonist approaches the leader, bringing up the 3 maids they had agreed upon before. But at that moment, Xiaoyu interrupts the situation, stating that they had no time for that, and for that reason, they were already leaving. Soon after, they start walking away from the village. At that moment, an unknown person calls out, asking them to wait. Then she grabs Yi's hand. The protagonist is very surprised as the leader suddenly kisses his cheek, thanking him for everything he had done. Meanwhile, Xiaoyu is visibly frustrated by what she has just seen. And the elf then says that whenever you wish, you could come to see her. Without wasting any time, the boy quickly accepts that offer. But at that moment, Xiaoyu interferes in the situation again, stating that they should leave immediately. Thus, they finally manage to leave the village. Once again, time passes and the scene cuts to a light descending from the sky, landing on a house. And from that light, an unknown door emerges. Meanwhile, the elven leader observes everything, telling everyone not to panic as it was only the Holy Faith's transfer technique. At that moment, a woman appears from that portal and then begins observing all the elves. The other girls then look at the newcomer and comment that she was a high-ranking knight of the Holy Faith, and for that reason, they should show respect. Soon after, the elven leader starts to bow to that person, thinking that she could not simply be a high-ranking knight, because they should at least be at the level of a knight commander. For that reason, she was probably the Pope's knight responsible for overseeing the entire province of Ide. Additionally, it was said that they were supposed to be saint-level powerhouses. At that moment, the woman begins speaking, saying that a reconnaissance knight had reported that the orcs were heading to that location for an invasion. The elven leader confirms that this was true, but fortunately, a brave passerby appeared to help them handle the entire situation. Observing that magical power, another girl asks if that was not a trace of mana from a demigod's power. Another woman then questions whether they had exterminated the Great Master and Orc Prince. However, another girl suggests that they should ask the elves about the whereabouts of the orcs' sacred items. However, the woman responds no, and for that reason, they should leave immediately. The other girl tells her master that if this was truly a hero, then the sacred object could have been taken as a trophy. However, the woman says that only registered heroes had that right. But although the orc's sacred artifact was an insignificant relic, they were involved in the affairs of the sacred item hunters that the Holy Faith was pursuing and capturing, and for that reason, they should bring her that specific person alive. At that moment, the other girl removes her coat, solemnly stating that she will obey the sacred order. Thus, time passes and the scene cuts to the province of Ide. Meanwhile, the protagonist and that woman seem to be walking through that field. Xiaoyu, calling Yi an idiot, responds that this was not an immortal world, but another one entirely. He says that he had already realized that because the patterns of aura circulation were completely different here, seeming more favorable for cultivation. Xiaoyu in turn denies it, saying that obviously he had no cultivation-based realm and questioning how he could perceive the flow of spiritual energy. However, the protagonist responds that he had established a foundation just yesterday, yet he had still not been able to find an effective technique. Xiaoyu, hearing what the boy had said, is very surprised, thinking that he had managed to do that incredibly fast. Yi then says that to progress from now on, special effort would be necessary, and for that reason, just thinking about it brought back terrible memories. Thus, the boy begins telling a long story about his past. However, Xiaoyu says that he had already told that story more than 80 times and asks if he never got tired of it. Besides, there were no female cultivators around to admire his legendary feats. Yi then asks if there had not been a single female cultivator because there was no way to get stronger and faster without hunting monsters and encountering misfortunes. Xiaoyu in turn says that based on her experience of being there for 3 months, his best bet would be to become an adventurer and then kill more monsters. An adventurer was someone skilled with weapons, a bold knight who possessed a unique ability to rid people of evil and bring peace to the kingdom. By annihilating monsters and demonic creatures, they completed missions to earn money and in doing so improved both their strength and reputation. Successful adventurers had the opportunity to be promoted to registered heroes and in turn became warriors admired by thousands of people. Additionally, registered heroes had unimaginable privileges, such as even claiming any woman they desired, or even searching people's homes at any time. Moreover, they did not have to hand over the loot they collected. Observing that explanation, the protagonist is very surprised, wondering if something that good really existed. Thus, he quickly decides that he will become an adventurer. Xiaoyu asks if he had made his decision that easily, and for that reason, they should go to the Adventurers Guild to register, and because of that, their next destination would be the city of Ade. Meanwhile, someone is apparently watching the two through binoculars. Then it is revealed to be that woman from before, who was alongside that saint. Soon after, she lowers her binoculars to the ground and observing the route assumes that those two were probably heading to the city of Ade. For that reason, it would be best to observe carefully because after all, he was the hero who had stopped the Great Master and Orc Prince. Once again, time passes and the scene shifts to the city of Ade, going directly to the Adventurers Guild. A woman then begins introducing the place, stating that it was the Adventurers Guild of the city of Ade and asking how she could help them. Ye, observing the girl's beauty, is in disbelief. Thus, a strange knowledge had been acquired, thinking that the outfits in that world were truly incredible and considering the possibility of young Xiaoyu wearing them. Soon after, he remembers a possibility like that. Meanwhile, Xiaoyu was closely observing the situation, and after fixing everything, she approaches the woman, saying that they would like to register as adventurers. Thus, time passes and several procedures are completed. Soon after, the girl then asks why they don't try to defeat the Mystic Vine. Observing that monster, the protagonist says that it looked like something familiar, where soon after he remembers some scenes that could end up becoming reality. The boy then becomes very determined, stating that they would definitely take that mission. However, things did not go as the protagonist had planned, because when they went to do that mission, it was actually him who ended up getting caught in those vines. The boy, desperate, asks Xiaoyu to save him. Soon after, the girl appears, managing to defeat all those vines, and the mission is completed. Meanwhile, that other woman from before was observing the whole situation. Thus, she begins taking notes on a piece of paper, assuming that it was the boy who had cast that lightning, and for that reason, she believed that he did not need to conjure it at all. The scene cuts to that other girl from before who is very surprised, stating that they were very efficient as rookies, and for that reason she should allow herself to assign them harder tasks one after another. However, the boy says that it was unnecessary because he would choose one on his own. Soon after, he finds a mission to defeat slimes, thinking that it seemed quite simple because he did not want to be hit by lightning again. The scene shifts to another location, where the group is apparently starting another mission. He thinks that on that day, Xiaoyu would see his battle with that monster and understand his worth in that world. At that moment, the boy notices something. Meanwhile, Xiaoyu is apparently afraid of something as there is simply a slime in front of her. He then says that it was just a slime and for that reason, it was very cute. However, the girl says that she does not want to see it. Observing the situation, the protagonist thinks that there was no monster like that in his original world. And for that reason, Xiaoyu was probably afraid of that type of slimy creature. Then he calls out to the girl, stating that she was very cute. The girl, along with the slime, then looks very confused by what the protagonist had said. Yi says that it was cute how she felt proud when being praised by him, or even when she acted crazy after being struck by lightning, or even when she was facing a monster while scared, revealing her weak side. She was obviously frightened, and for that reason, she should not act as if she was trying to hide it from him. Then he begins to approach the slime, asking how it dared to threaten his friend. For that reason, it should show its true ability, and because of that, he was going to make a move. At that moment, the slime seemingly activates an ability. Observing the situation, Yi says that it was the mimicry skill, a move that could change the slime's shape and style. The purpose of that move was to confuse the enemy with no effectiveness in combat. But at that moment, the slime appears to take the form of a person, where soon after it transforms into a girl. The protagonist, observing that situation, is in disbelief as that slime simply had no clothes. The slime, observing itself, seems confused. Meanwhile, the protagonist appears to be analyzing the movements of that creature. Thus, he begins analyzing every part of that monster, and soon after, he seems to enjoy it. At that moment, he is mentally defeated. Observing the situation, Xiaoyu remarks that the boy was not demonstrating good combat ethics. And soon after, she realizes that she is alone. Quickly, the girl invokes her ability, launching a lightning strike toward the slime. Meanwhile, that other girl is still watching the three of them. She begins taking notes in her notebook. She writes that the protagonist was afraid of slimes but still possessed incredibly powerful magic that could not be underestimated. Observing Xiaoyu, the girl comments that she seemed to be a very formidable person, and for that reason, when they were separated, she would have to choose which one to observe. Thus, time passes and the scene shifts to a room at the Adventurers Guild quarters. Yi responds that Xiaoyu had tortured him in every possible way since she had reached a realm higher than his, and because of that, each strike landed on a vital area, and she was probably trying to kill him. But even so, he couldn't rely only on his realm to deal with that girl. And for that reason, he had already decided that he had no other choice but to use his nearly lost treasure. Soon after, the boy retrieves that treasure from before. Time passes and the scene shifts to another location. Meanwhile, he seems to be calling Xiaoyu, saying that if she wasn't busy and had some time, she should study the dream butterfly fusion. Xiaoyu says that it was a sophisticated technique, and for that reason, the boy should study it by himself. She states that since her cultivation was superior to his, he must have thought she would at least help him with that. Observing the situation, Xiaoyu says that since the boy asked in that way, she simply couldn't refuse. For that reason, he should be willing to admit that his knowledge and skills were below hers, which required courage. Besides, she would only give him hints once, so he should watch carefully because she wouldn't demonstrate it again. Soon after, the girl appears to use that ability, and at that moment, she changes her form. Xiaoyu explains that using those two techniques simultaneously creates illusions that, however, no one could perceive aside from that transformation. Yi then concludes that if that happened, she wouldn't be any different from an elf. At that moment, he pulls out that sacred object from before, saying that she should try it. Observing that object, Xiaoyu realizes that it was the orc's sacred item, and at that moment, she begins to feel something different in her body. The girl asks what the protagonist wants. However, Yi responds that he only needs her to promise 3 things: that she should no longer be angry with him, that she should not cast lightning anymore, and that she should call him brother. Noticing the girl's silence, the protagonist questions why she isn't saying anything and wonders if she had become too arrogant in the past few days. For that reason, he bets that she didn't have that object hidden as a secret weapon, and for that reason, she was keeping a great distance from him. At that moment, the protagonist tosses that object into the air, which soon after falls to the ground and shatters. Observing the situation, Yi is very surprised by what happened, as his object had simply been broken. Soon after, the boy picks up that object again. He says that Xiaoyu had worked hard in the past few days, and for that reason, she should rest well while he completed the day's task. Soon after, he closes the door and quickly starts running out of that place. Meanwhile, Xiaoyu observes the situation, stating that she was not truly an elf and questioning how that thing could have been useful to her. Moreover, even without that orc relic, the boy could probably still face her. Time passes and the scene shifts to nighttime. Meanwhile, a creature is apparently being defeated, and then it is revealed that the protagonist is completing those tasks. Looking at the paper, the boy says that the strength of that monster, the pseudo-legendary, was roughly at the nascent soul level, and that by using those immortal swords, it would be much easier to defeat those creatures. But even so, he needed to improve his realm to become stronger. Then he exits that cave while appearing to whistle. Meanwhile, that girl from before is watching the protagonist, thinking that this was the lair of the young corrupted dragon and wondering what business he could have there. Moreover, it was impossible for an adventurer without a party and without a healer to defeat the dragon. However, the girl thinks she should forget about it because after following him for so long, what was she doing? She was finally getting the opportunity to observe him again. Then a voice emerges behind the girl, saying that after following him for so long, she had waited until he was alone. Quickly, the girl turns around asking who was there, as the Holy Faith Knight needed that task to be carried out. And for that reason, she had nothing to do with it. Recognizing the other girl, she asks if, by any chance, she was a succubus. The woman replies that it was a coincidence because she had also been waiting for that young man to be alone, but even so, she wanted to know why the girl was following him. However, the girl replies that she had no time to investigate whether she was qualified or not to practice succubus arts. But even so, she interfered in that situation again, she would end up regretting it. The succubus then starts approaching the girl, saying that it seems she still didn't understand the situation, questioning how she wanted to die. The other girl then becomes very irritated, asking how she dared to speak so insolently to a Holy Faith Knight. At that moment, the succubus jumps and lunges at the other girl, asking if she knew what had happened to the people who had offended her brother's sect, and moreover, how many people she had killed. Observing the situation, the girl says that the power of that other succubus was too great, and at that moment, her shield shatters. Quickly, the succubus launches another attack, saying that the girl wouldn't be able to block it. Observing the situation, the other girl begins chanting an incantation, and at that moment, the succubus's axe starts being enveloped by a strange liquid. Thus, the axe is flung away. Quickly, the other girl grabs her sword and warns not to underestimate her as she was still a knight. Observing the situation, the succubus makes a hand sign, successfully trapping the girl's sword. Grabbing the sword, the succubus asks if she was resorting to that same trick and for that reason might actually be her rival. The other woman, confused, asks what kind of spell that was, and the succubus replies that it was from the Michiana sect, the Cloud Formation. At that moment, she shatters the attack directed at the other girl, who then falls off the mountain. But at that moment, she begins using her incantation, managing to save herself from the fall. Soon after, she crashes to the ground but is already unconscious. Meanwhile, the succubus watches the situation from above, stating that her energy was still insufficient, and that surely relying solely on the energy of women meant that time was running out. Meanwhile, the girl starts searching for her hammer. Time passes, and the scene shifts to the Adventurers Guild, where that other woman from before is presenting an extra mission, as the succubus who used forbidden magic was on the loose, and for that reason, they needed help. Soon after, that woman approaches Xiaoyu, stating that the reward was high and for that reason, they should accept the mission. Thus, the wanted poster of the succubus is presented. At that moment, Xiaoyu is very surprised as she apparently recognizes that person. Quickly, she accepts the mission to carry it out. Again, the scene shifts to another location, and meanwhile, the protagonist seems somewhat surprised by something, stating that the world was so strange that even girls could fall from the sky. Moreover, she reminded him of that girl from before called Yun, but was slightly more beautiful. Then the protagonist begins approaching the girl, but at that moment, he says that he shouldn't be indifferent in that way toward other people. Soon after, he picks the girl up onto his back, stating that there was no other way to resolve that conflict. Thus, time passes, and the scene moves to a cave where Yi seems to be cleaning the girl with water. At that moment, she wakes up, asking who was there with her. Looking to the side, the girl sees the protagonist. At that moment, Yi opens his eyes and starts observing the girl, who appears to be embarrassed. Then, Yi begins apologizing, stating that he was only helping her wake up so he could heal her with a special magic. And for that reason, he had completely removed her clothes to take her out of danger. But even so, she shouldn't worry. After all that explanation, the girl apparently doesn't believe a word of it. Soon after, she runs out of the place, calling the protagonist a pervert. Then that woman leaves the place but quickly remembers something. Shortly after, she returns to the cave, asking where her clothes were. Pointing his finger, the protagonist says that he did not understand the structure of her clothes, and for that reason, when he removed them, they simply got ruined. The other girl then becomes very irritated, stating that the protagonist was really an idiot. At the same moment, the girl realizes once again that she was completely naked. And soon after, she becomes very embarrassed, starting to run out of the cave again, stating that he would either pay for her clothes or die. At the same moment, he begins to take something out of his portal, presenting some peculiar clothes to the girl. However, if she found them inadequate, there were still other options, and he begins to present a few more to her. But even so, that was still not enough. Irritated, Yi ends up giving up, telling the girl to do whatever she wants, but at the same moment, she asks to take one of the clothes. Shortly after, she ends up choosing one of them. Again, time passes. Yi, outside the cave, asks if the girl had already finished dressing. However, she responds that the dress was very difficult to wear. Nonetheless, the protagonist replies that this was true, but even so, he could not help her put it on. Once again, time passes and he asks if the girl had finished. Without getting a response, Yi seems to become very frustrated. Shortly after, he enters the cave, and upon observing the scene, he is very surprised. The other girl says that there was nothing she could do about it, and for that reason, he should not have strange ideas. Changing the subject, Yi says that the girl had fallen from a very high place and that her 5 viscera had been damaged. Furthermore, her distress was aggravating all her wounds and her body's suffering would not stop. The other girl responds that the Knights of Santa Fe had the blessing of protection, and for that reason, that would have no effect. At that moment, the protagonist begins a countdown. Shortly after, the girl apparently begins to feel something. At the same moment, she ends up spitting blood. Then Yi approaches the girl, stating that since her internal organs were damaged, she would have attacks like that for a long time. And because of that, if she continued like that, she probably would not survive until the next day. Having no other choice, the woman asks if the protagonist would only treat her wounds and do nothing else. Our boy then swears that he would, asking the woman what she thought his intentions were. They had barely met, and for that reason, he was not obliged to save her. He should only consider it an act of kindness to help her. And because of that, if the girl did not want help, he would simply leave. Observing the situation, the woman realizes that she had no other choice. She says that for the Knights of Santa Fe, religious discipline is strict, and that, for that reason, while she was in a coma, she did not think about it, but now being lucid, she understood the situation. He questions whether she was lucid now, stating that he had just said that the clothing needed to be removed in order to heal her. The knight responds that the Son of God said that people are sinners and that giving birth was an impure act, and therefore agreeing to take off her clothes in front of him while being lucid meant consenting to show something illicit. And because of that, it was very embarrassing. But even so, the girl was ready and willing to commit to him. And for that reason, the girl would belong entirely to the protagonist. At that moment, the scene cuts to the city of Incent. Meanwhile, a woman seemed to be performing a spell. Then it is revealed that it was that succubus from before, stating that she had finally fed her abdomen to fullness. Thus, she ends up thanking the other girl who was unconscious. At that moment, the succubus begins to leave that place, saying that she needed to deal with that fallen thing from before. Again, the scene cuts to another place, this time at the Adventurers Guild. Xiaoyu says that she needed to find that idiot and warn him about Yu's matters. At that moment, the succubus, along with Xiaoyu, begins to perform a spell to go to the designated location. And at that moment, a glow appears among the stars. Xiaoyu and that other succubus apparently meet. Again, the scene cuts to that cave with the girl saying that she now belonged to Yi. Yi, observing the situation, is very surprised. And at that moment, he becomes thoughtful. Shortly after, he says that he understands, looking toward the girl, who, meanwhile, seemed to be very surprised, thinking that the protagonist had really accepted that offer. And for that reason, that goddess should forgive her sin. For this reason, she should take only that body into the world and devote herself to the man right before her eyes. Shortly after, he finishes his explanation, asking the other girl to turn around. The girl, surprised, questions whether that really had to be done from behind, and the protagonist responds that yes, it did. Then that woman ends up turning her back. The protagonist places his hand on the girl's shoulder, stating that it might hurt a little at first, but in the end, it would be fine. The girl then accepts it. Shortly after, she just waits. The protagonist begins to massage her back. The girl, frustrated, says that she could not know much about that aspect, but that continuously was not what it was about. Yi, frustrated, says that it was necessary in order to perform her healing, and because of that, those noises were very common, as all of that was just the fluctuation of his aura. The girl, in turn, is very surprised, not understanding what the protagonist was talking about regarding that healing. He says that he had just explained to the girl earlier that since those clothes were very light, it was not necessary to undress and lie down with him. And for that reason, they would begin the treatment right away. Returning to the present, he seemed to be very frustrated, stating that the girl had not been listening before. Observing the whole situation, the girl becomes very embarrassed as she had been thinking of something else. Thus, time passes again, and he finally begins to perform the healing again. Shortly after, that woman says that those are the words of the Holy Son of God, and for that reason, the Knights of Santa Fe should accept and respect them. Observing the situation, the protagonist questions who that Son of God really was. At that moment, that woman crosses her hands, stating that the Son of God was the Pope and the Master of Santa Fe, who was the head of the agents and the spokesperson of the Lord of that world. Because of this, they believed, grew strong, and were doing all of this for the love of God and their own accord. Observing the situation, Yi says that it was very interesting not for himself, but for others, questioning whether all of that was really just for the love of God, and therefore his divine being must have tremendous prestige. The girl then says that she could see that the protagonist was from a distant place, as foreigners were usually rude toward their god. However, the protagonist responds that for his people, that situation was very unusual, thinking that ideas like God were things meant to be killed, saying that by healing the girl, he was also serving Santa Fe, asking if by chance there was a reward for that. The woman in turn becomes very happy, asking if the protagonist was willing to convert, as their faith always welcomed new disciples to teach those closest to the church. He even questions whether they only gave a beautiful person as a reward or even money afterward for all that. Time passes and Yi asks if the girl was feeling better. The girl then says that she was feeling much better. Yi says that he used Reiki to treat her internal injuries and aligned her meridians for her. Because of that, she would be fine after resting for a few days. Shortly after, the girl thanks the protagonist for his help, but he says she should not mention it, as helping others was just a trivial matter. Soon after, Yi responds that it was already quite late at night. At that moment, the protagonist begins to perform a spell called Spirit Assimilation. Apparently, he had done something to the girl's body. He thinks that since he had just healed her, his aura still remained in her body. At that moment, his spiritual assimilation arts would certainly hit the target. Although it was only the lowest ranked version, it was enough, because it should ensure success in his following matters. Furthermore, he could truly choose a girl in the middle of nowhere without having been supervised. For that reason, his cultivation journey would otherwise be in vain. Shortly after, the scene cuts to another place, and the succubus says that it seemed that the girl was still around, questioning whether it had not been enough after being wounded. Soon after, she ends up finding that cave, saying that she would go to that place. Meanwhile, Xiaoyu was in that place, apparently very afraid of the dark. Furthermore, she wanted to know what the protagonist was doing. Then the scene returns to where the protagonist was asking the girl what she was doing in that place. She then responds that she was just passing by. At that moment, he ends up snapping his fingers, stating that it would be better to tell the truth, otherwise there would be consequences. At that moment, words begin to spill from the girl's mouth, where it is revealed that she had spoken about the orc artifact because her master had researched the person who had that artifact in hand. Yi then questions who the girl's master was. She hesitates to answer, but still she says that it was the Pope's Knight Azuri, and for that reason, she was her own retainer knight. The protagonist asks what she intended to do after finding him. The girl responds that her master had ordered her to bring the boy to her alive. Yi is then very surprised, asking if she had been planning to capture him from the beginning. The girl says that the original plan was to capture the protagonist and then torture him. Then the protagonist raises his hand. Shortly after, he ends up striking the girl, stating that he had protected the elven village and shown great goodwill by performing good deeds. But still, all those people wanted to interrogate him and torture him severely. For that reason, the girl would suffer divine justice. Amidst that situation, the girl responds that it was her master's mission, and for that reason, she had no choice but to fulfill it. Yi then questions why they were so concerned with the artifacts of the sacred orc. The knight says that although the artifacts were among the lowest ranks, they were still involved in the affairs of the artifact hunters that Sanofi pursued. For that reason, that artifact was of great concern. Observing the situation, the protagonist thinks that she had been caught up in this. That was why his spiritual assimilation was weaker at that moment, but at least he had managed to discover what Santa Fe was plotting against him. However, even though it was not easy to bring his spiritual assimilation arts to full effect, he should have fun enjoying all of it, asking what the girl would do if she admired someone. However, she responds that she had never had such intimate contact with a man. For that reason, that day had been her first time. But still, her heart pounded with a very pleasant and, moreover, very strange sensation. Shortly after, Yi asks what her 3 measurements were. Thus, the girl ends up revealing her body measurements. Then the woman grabs the protagonist's clothing, stating that he should stop using his spiritual magic because they did not tolerate that kind of dishonor. Ye, in turn, is very surprised, thinking that the girl had used all the strength in her body to break his spiritual assimilation. Then the girl pulls the protagonist again. Thus, the two end up falling to the ground. Meanwhile, the succubus was entering the cave. Shortly after, she finds the protagonist along with the girl in that scene. She then begins to observe the two. Yun, noticing Yi, asks if he was perhaps feeling guilty and if he should leave. The protagonist, observing that situation, is incredulous. Shortly after, he starts to recognize the girl's facial expression and features. Yun, meanwhile, is very irritated, saying that to give his clothes to other people, he must have been really stupid. Moreover, she was in that place, but even so, he kept pressuring that girl, asking if by any chance he wanted to die. Quickly, the protagonist releases the girl and starts to leave, saying that an unforeseen event had occurred, and for that reason, he should explain himself. The girl then only gives a smile in response. Shortly after, she launches an attack toward Yi. Observing the situation, the boy thinks that she was definitely trying to attack him. Shortly after, he manages to defend against that attack. Observing the protagonist's defense, the girl questions whether he was still only at the Foundation establishment realm. However, the boy responds that it was not what she really thought. Yun, in turn, questions whether that even mattered, saying that during the time they had not been together, she kept thinking about the protagonist, but she could not say the same about him. He responds that the two had been raised together since childhood, and for that reason, she recognized him. However, it was not good to continue that discussion in that place, and for that reason, they should leave. The girl then becomes very irritated and once again invokes her spell, surrounding the protagonist from all sides, asking if he did not think the two were very connected. Shortly after, she launches that attack toward the boy, who then is apparently hit. Observing the situation, Yun wonders if she had perhaps gone too far. At that moment, the girl is very surprised because her magic begins to break apart. And before her, the protagonist appears, immobilizing his sister with that sword. Yun then becomes very happy, saying that her brother was indeed much stronger, because he could win in the Foundation establishment realm without putting himself into a fight. Ye, in turn, says that the girl caused too many problems. Moreover, his imitation of the immortal sword had already reached its limit. Amidst that situation, Ion says that she was aware of that. At that moment, she ends up using the attack, and the protagonist's sword breaks. Shortly after, Ion delivers a strike to the boy's stomach, saying that even exceeding the 4 realms, her brother had still not been stopped by her hand. At that moment, the girl positions herself above Yi. Meanwhile, the other woman was observing the entire situation. Yun asks her not to interfere. Thus, she ends up surrounding the girl with all that magic. Then, Ion places her hand on Yi's face. Shortly after, she was about to kiss him. The knight, meanwhile, was watching all of it. Ion then becomes very pleased as she had finally managed to do it. Moreover, her brother's vitality was very strong, and because of that, his body was full of energy. Amidst that situation, the protagonist asks if he could be released now. However, Ion responds that it was just a joke because the main issue had not even started yet. At that moment, Chiou arrives at the scene beginning to analyze what was happening, saying that she had been wondering why the protagonist had taken that mission. At that moment, she quickly changes her mind because now she knows what was going on, and for that reason, Yi was truly an idiot. The protagonist, in turn, asks to be allowed to explain. Then the other succubus says that it had been a long time since she last saw her sister. Chiou says that when she convinced her to surround the protagonist and force him to answer, she asked if she had already planned all of that. Yun says that although she was right in thinking that it had been her idea, the escalation of all subsequent events was not part of her plan. Then, Chiou approaches the girl, questioning why she was on top of the protagonist at that moment. Moreover, she wanted to know why that careless person was wearing her clothes. The protagonist tries to speak and says that it was just a misunderstanding, but the other two tell the boy to just shut up. Meanwhile, the knight was observing that situation. At that moment, she ends up biting her finger, letting her blood drip onto a specific spot. Thinking that before they noticed it, she had to hurry. Meanwhile, Yun says that when it came to that sort of thing, she believed that the first to arrive won. Therefore, her brother and she had innocent games since they were young. And for that reason, if they were not intentionally causing trouble, there would be no problem. Moreover, perhaps they could end up having many children and grandchildren together at that moment, questioning whether she should be the one to be upset. Xiaoyu then becomes surprised, asking if the protagonist had not told her before, because in fact, Xiaoyu had been the first person to kiss the boy. The woman then becomes very irritated, questioning whether that was true. However, Yun responds that it had just been an accident. Amidst that situation, Yun says that she would play the boy's game, stating that she and the protagonist had already bathed together. Xiaoyu, irritated, asks if that was true, and the protagonist remains silent. Then he says that it was only when they were children. Xiaoyu then says that after all, she had taken the lead. She had never had the courage to go that far with the protagonist. Yun, irritated, says that was true, but not even Xiaoyu had managed to do anything. Standing up, Yun says that she really should explain herself because she had Yang and Pure before, but now they could do whatever they wanted. However, once again, the two tell the boy to shut up. Then Yun says that it seemed like Xiaoyu had come looking for her to exchange blows that day. Xiaoyu then questions what she would do if that were true, and whether she would, by any chance, run away. Starting to cast a spell, Yun then asks her to come closer. Thus, Xiaoyu quickly casts her spell. Meanwhile, that knight was still casting her own spell, which then finally seemed to be ready. Shortly after, it appears to take shape. The scene then cuts to another place, a random location in the province of Ade, and a man seemed to be very irritated, saying that they had done nothing wrong, and for that reason, they should be allowed to go. The other girl says that she had heard numerous reports from the people saying that they had kidnapped the elderly, because in order to get rid of his old mother, that man had thrown her into the mountains. She had good intentions and merely suppressed that old man and sent him to a better place. Shortly after, that girl cast a spell, hurling it toward the other woman. Observing the situation, the other man says that it was holy water. And approaching the girl, he asks if she was okay. The other unknown person questions that woman and says that he wanted to say something because she was actually a heretic necromancer. With tears on her face, the woman says that she really had done nothing. Then that man approaches the woman, saying that he had asked her not to interfere that time, but still it was fine because he was actually by her side. Moreover, Sanctify was ridiculous, and over the years that his wife endured the Baron's oppression, she had not been in that place. And now that he had resurrected his wife to live a peaceful life in the mountains, they had come knocking at his door. And if they thought of them as ants they could stomp on at will, they were completely mistaken. At that moment, that man begins to chant a spell, apparently summoning an unknown being. Shortly after, the ground starts to crack. The man was seemingly trying to draw some kind of power, stating that it would bring destruction upon his enemies. And at that moment, something begins to emerge from the ground. Shortly after, it moves toward that woman. Then it is revealed that a giant dragon appears in the sky. That dragon begins to observe the unknown girl. The other man then starts to praise that creature, stating that he bet she had never dreamed of meeting a necromancer of such caliber. However, now was too late because, since this was a world that could not tolerate his goodwill, they would perish. For that reason, they should behold his wickedness. At that moment, that dragon begins to advance toward the girl. She then says that heresy had been confirmed and that he was the legendary master of necromancy, the assassin Baron Peyton. Grabbing her weapon, the girl declares that she is the Pope's Blue Knight and therefore would judge that situation in the name of the church. Hearing what the girl had said, the man is very surprised, asking how such a small girl could be a knight of the Pope. At that moment, that woman begins to cast a spell, which within seconds is launched at the dragon, easily subduing the creature. However, the attack does not stop there, as it advances toward the other couple. Quickly, the man tries to protect his woman. However, it was already too late as all of them had already been defeated. Then the other girl tries to contact her subordinate, asking if she had managed to find the orc artifact. For that reason, it was already time for the next judgment. Thus, the scene cuts to the present time and an unknown door appears in the place. Shortly after, a person steps out of it. The girl from before also steps out of that door, saying that the knight had performed very well. The knight, realizing that her master had arrived, is very pleased. Meanwhile, Yan and Shoyu were very frustrated, asking the protagonist who that woman was. The protagonist in turn responds that he had no idea. Moreover, it was dangerous to stay there, and for that reason, they should flee. Amidst that situation, the other girl declares that the judgment would begin. Observing the situation, Juno thinks that this was the master that the sub-knight had spoken of before, saying that they had done no harm to that person and therefore wanted to know what they could have committed to justify a judgment. Thus, the knight responds that he was the only suspect of hiding sacred artifacts, and that he had prepared his spiritual magic to do something shameful to the holy knights. The other two become very curious, asking what the protagonist had done. Ye, in turn, responds that they could discuss it first because he was leaving. Shortly after, the other girl says that the protagonist was suspected of hiding sacred artifacts. Thus, he had dishonored the holy knights and for that reason should be taken for immediate judgment. Meanwhile, Yan and Xiaoyu observed the situation, asking what that girl was trying to say. Yan responds that it seemed like that woman was planning to take the protagonist, and she clearly wanted to steal her man. Shortly after, the two begin to glare at the girl. Xiaoyu questions whether she was one of the legendary knights of the Pope's holy class. Yan responds that was exactly it. Her strength was roughly within the divine realm, and that realm was superior to their own. Amidst that situation, Xiaoyu asks if that meant they would have to fight. Yan responds that that woman was trying to steal her man, and for that reason, they had no other choice. Then, Xiaoyu approaches the woman, asking if they were entirely in agreement. However, Yan tells her to save her breath because all that was left to ask was which of them would take the first step. Quickly, Xiaoyu begins casting a spell, declaring that she would attack first. At that moment, a bolt of lightning descends from the sky, heading toward that woman. She quickly manages to dodge the attack. Xiaoyu asks if she understood that lightning and once again casts another spell, sending another bolt toward that girl. She then manages to block it with her sword. Shortly after, she uses her sword to slice through a rock. The protagonist, observing this, is very surprised. Thus, those rocks end up splitting apart. Quickly, Yun assists that other knight from before. Then she releases her onto the ground. The knight then thanks Yun. However, she asks her not to misunderstand, saying she only did it because she was worried the girl might damage her clothes. At that moment, she tosses a cloak to the girl, asking her to put it on to keep her outfit safe. The protagonist, meanwhile, is watching the battle from below as Xiaoyu and that woman are engaged in an epic fight. Shortly after, the two begin staring each other down. Xiaoyu asks if that was really a knight of the Pope. They say all of them are holy class power, but it seemed that was no lie. The other woman says that Xiaoyu's strength must be close to the legendary class. A powerhouse like her shouldn't be using such a low-quality artifact with her skills, questioning why she was protecting that person. Xiaoyu in turn responds that it was none of her business but still decides to answer. Shortly after, she begins casting a larger spell, stating that she would do her best to protect that idiot. In the name of Yi Shi, she would not let the girl get near the protagonist and, for that reason, had made an oath. The wounded listening to this remains silent, stating that regardless of that, since she was unwilling to cooperate, it was no different from heresy. Xiaoyu, irritated, says that it makes no difference. The saint says that was arrogant. She might be strong, but she was still on a much lower level than Xiaoyu. Then the girl starts laughing, questioning if she was referring to their realms. Then she simply did not understand because immortal cultivators were the kind of people who did nothing but break their limits to turn the tide in their favor. At that moment, she casts another spell toward the saint, who then throws her sword to counterattack. Thus, their attacks collide. However, that saint apparently still had a plan, and she had another sword prepared to strike. Observing the situation, Wu says that this was bad because she had thrown a second sword. Quickly, he casts a spell to help the girl, beginning to use it to ascend toward Xiaoyu. Meanwhile, the attack was still heading toward the girl. However, Wu manages to help defend against the attack, but even so, it was still not enough. Thus, he ends up constructing a giant wall to block the attack. Even with all that, the spell was on the verge of breaking. At that moment, it shatters. However, you still had not given up on saving the girl, stepping in front to take the attack in Xiaoyu's place. Observing the situation, Yi says that was impossible, because even with a set of spatial half barriers, Yu's formation had still been destroyed. Meanwhile, the two girls were still falling toward the ground. Shortly after, they enter freefall. Yu, in turn, asks Xiaoyu not to worry about her. At that moment, the girl grabs a talisman to heal her sister. However, they still had no time to think. At that moment, an unknown sword appears in front of the saint. The protagonist advises the girl to stay quiet there and says he thought she didn't understand the consequences of harming his girls. Shortly after, the saint demands that the man hand over the orc artifact and then return with her for judgment. Our protagonist responds that it was a shame that he wasn't the kind of master who followed people's orders, because he did not wish to take that forbidden drug, but since the situation forced him, he would have to do it. And at that moment, he takes out an unknown pill. Upon consuming it, he states that he truly had no choice. At that moment, our boy seems to feel something different. The saint, observing this, is very surprised, thinking that this power was close to the Pope's domain. Our boy, with a threatening gaze, begins to look at the saint, saying that he had finally returned to the immortal and eternal realm. The saint, witnessing this, was terrified because that guy's presence was overwhelming. Moreover, she was frozen with fear, and for that reason, she could not move. Then the protagonist approaches the saint, and grabbing a vial, he says that the little knight was daring to be extremely arrogant. Shortly after, he throws the vial at the girl, who, confused, asks what it was. But at that moment, she is surprised because the protagonist, along with those two girls, had disappeared. Thus, the scene cuts to the Adventurers Guild in the city of Hyde, and within seconds, the protagonist, along with his companions, appears in that place. So everything seemed to have been resolved. Xiaoyu, irritated, demands to be released. Shortly after, she begins to walk away, seemingly annoyed. Observing the situation, Yun seemed very frustrated, thinking that they had really been defeated. Then she ends up hitting Yi, saying that he was still holding on. Observing the situation, the protagonist thinks he understands why Xiaoyu is upset with him, but he still doesn't understand why the other one is. At that moment, Xiaoyu calls out to Yi, questioning why he took the two of them away by force. After all, he had just returned to the immortal earthly realm. However, Yi responds that it could not be that simple. Xiaoyu, in turn, is very surprised, questioning how he had managed to deceive her anyway. Yi then responds that he had used the false bravado pill, which was a miraculous pill that could only be taken from the Gucho bag after an established foundation, allowing him to display the strength of the highest realm the protagonist could achieve, but still not providing real compatibility. Even so, Xiaoyu seemed very confused, asking what the boy had thrown at her earlier, and the protagonist responds that it was a type of water that deactivated magic tracking for 3 hours. So during that period, she was impossible to find, just like all of them. Xiaoyu, in turn, questions what there was to fear, because she, along with the power of yin and yang, if combined, could overcome the attack. However, the protagonist responds that they were still not capable of doing that. Xiaoyu then becomes very irritated, questioning how that could be true since their realms were very high. However, he responds that it was about much more than just realms, because there was something peculiar about their weapons. Thus, the group ends up changing the subject, and Yin asks Xiaoyu to examine the wound on her back. Xiaoyu then apologizes for her carelessness, questioning what that had to do with that person's weapons. Then he asks if she had ever heard of the mobile formation of the Hidden Blade sect. Xiaoyu responds that she had because it was one of the most elusive battle formations of the Mikuan sect. He responds that it was exactly that. However, despite being very effective, this formation was also extremely complicated to practice, and it was precisely for this reason that Yun became known as the master of the strongest defensive formation. Xiaoyu, in turn, is very surprised, saying that even so, she had still been injured by the attack. The other girl then says that could only mean one thing, and the protagonist responds that it was the power of the laws, because only by possessing that power could someone ignore the girl's ability. Xiaoyu then questions whether the power of the laws could be so significant if that world was governed by a different set of principles. He responds that she was right in saying that this world and theirs had many differences, but with the time they spent in the immortal earthly realm, they were able to snoop around and borrow a kind of role-based power, because there definitely existed people with access to that power, just like those two swords from before. Yun then asks if what he had managed to discover was the power of those two swords. He says that that girl clearly could use two swords to attack at the same time, but however, she preferred to use a different fighting pattern. So, no matter what the outcome of her first attack was, a second would definitely always hit. And that is why the ability of the two swords was such that even if one could dodge one blade, they were likely to be struck by the other. The holder of the title, the strongest in the world, through just one confrontation, could break down and precisely evaluate the martial arts of the holy class. And by using the crossed swords successively in an attack, if the first strike did not land, the second would, causing direct injury regardless of defense. Hearing what the boy had said, Shoei responds that if it was really the power of the rules, it would be very difficult to deal with. However, the protagonist responds that if he were in their place, he should be able to contain her, because the two of them simply had not reached that level yet, so they had to leave them out of the equation. Xiaoyu asks what they should do since the water that made them undetectable was only effective for 10 hours, and for that reason, she wanted to know what would happen after that. Yi then responds that that was exactly it because they only had 10 hours left, and for that reason, he would use the time as efficiently as possible to break into the nascent soul realm. Shortly after, the scene cuts to another location, where the knight asks her master if she's okay. However, she responds that some kind of liquid had entered her mouth. Then she ends up spitting it out. After that, she stands up, saying that she is fine. However, she had suffered such dishonor in vain, and for that reason, it was absolutely unforgivable. The knight notices that her master is not even looking at her, asking if she is, by any chance, angry. Then the saint raises her hand, saying that her knight had done well, and for the humiliation they had suffered, she would judge those people. The knight is then very surprised, saying that she is behind her and wanting to know why she is caressing the air. The saint then says that before returning to the Holy See, she would investigate the scene to track their traces. But at that moment, the woman ends up hitting her head against a tree. Thus, it is revealed that due to the injection of the external use potion, she got ingested a little, and for that reason, its effect was stronger. Once again, the scene cuts to the protagonist's house, and Xiaoyu responds that the boy had a total of 10 hours to do that. He says that there seemed to be no unexpected encounters and that it was inconvenient to overdo it in public. Therefore, reaching the nascent soul realm was impossible. Pearl diving was a technique that could temporarily borrow another person's cultivation base through intimate actions. And moreover, it was possible to return the pearls by continuing those actions. Xiaoyu, in turn, is very confused, asking what kind of intimate actions those were. Shortly after, her sister whispers in her ear, making her very embarrassed by what she had just heard. Then the protagonist tries to speak again, saying that since they were talking about succubus abilities, he could not help but think of a certain sect, which was actually that sect of love known for a sinister dual cultivation technique that absorbed the victim's cultivation through sex in the most devious and treacherous manner. Moreover, those people liked to mark the number of victims on their bodies, which was extraordinarily arrogant. Xiaoyu, in turn, becomes very irritated, asking if there was a need to mention such a lowly technique. Yi says that the nature of the succubus was vicious, making it a parasitic technique, and for that reason, its efficiency in transferring a cultivation base was highly advantageous. But on the other hand, the succubi's draining ability was a mutually beneficial technique, and while the succubi absorbed the other's vital energy, they could also send it back, filling their vitality for a brief yet intense moment, providing excessive benefits. And to combine it with the draining principle, the protagonist had just invented a new technique, and by returning what was borrowed, he would call that technique pearl diving. Xiaoyu, irritated, asks how Yi dared to do that. Meanwhile, Yun was laughing, saying that it was clear she had studied cultivation intensely, and although she was a bit older, she was still very indecent, and for that reason, she was no different from a child. Therefore, something as obscene as that, Xiaoyu did not want to accept. However, with the enemy so close, they had no time to waste, and for that reason, they could not hesitate. Then the succubus approaches the protagonist, saying that he should allow the two of them to perform that technique. The succubus then turns to Xiaoyu, saying that she should stay there to protect the two of them. At that moment, Xiaoyu grabs her sister, saying that she was thinking too well of herself. Yun says that Xiaoyu was taking the initiative to fight again, and the other girl, irritated, asks if she thought she was afraid of her. Yun, in turn, asks if the girl was someone skilled in shameful things. Hearing what her sister had just said, Xiaoyu becomes embarrassed, saying that as a celestial teacher, she simply had knowledge about that sort of thing in her mansion. And when it came to dual cultivation methods, she was no slouch either. The succubus is then very surprised, asking if she had ever practiced that with someone. However, she responds that she had not had the opportunity to do that yet. The succubus, in turn, asks if Xiaoyu had practiced that on her own, and Xiaoyu responds that obviously not. But at that moment, she suddenly pauses, asking if Yun had ever practiced it before. The succubus then responds that she had, leaving the protagonist and Xiaoyu very surprised by what they had just heard. And the succubus, in turn, says that she had practiced it on her own. Xiaoyu asks if that was even possible, and Yun responds that it was obvious. Xiaoyu becomes very irritated by that. Yun asks what was wrong, questioning whether it really mattered to her sister, who she thought about while practicing alone. Observing the situation, Yi remains silent, wondering whether he should be happy or terrified at that moment. Then Xiaoyu says that today she would practice that pearl extraction technique, and for that reason, all resistance was futile. The other succubus says that Xiaoyu has a very inconsistent mind, as just a moment ago she was yelling that no child should do it, but now she was being extremely proactive. Xiaoyu, in turn, says that there was no need to worry. Yun responds that it also didn't matter, but she needed to know that there was an order of arrival. For that reason, it was necessary to win over her brother soon without giving in even a little. So maybe Xiaoyu could have him after. The other girl, irritated, says that Yun wanted to be the first. However, she also desired that. Thus, the two start arguing. At that moment, the protagonist raises his hand and, trembling, says that actually they could do all three together. At that moment, both girls land a punch on Yi, who then falls to the ground in tears. Shortly after, the two girls take off their shoes, saying that even if it was dual cultivation, he was still wishing to make it a triple cultivation. Meanwhile, the two girls were beating the protagonist, who was begging to be allowed to explain, saying that his goal now was to break through the realm properly so that he could teach that little knight a lesson. For that reason, one of the simplest questions was whether it worked if he did dual cultivation with just one person, even if something big could happen. The two girls in turn become very confused. Then the protagonist gets up, dusting off his clothes, saying that, as they knew, he was born with two types of powers, one of which was the sword body. The other was the hybrid Toe's fetus. Then, Yu says that almost all the genius sword cultivators in history had that body by merit. He says that, on the other hand, the hybrid Toe's fetus was the most suitable merit body for cultivation, and everyone laughed when they said there was a person who possessed that body. Yi responds that was exactly it, and that he would say that those two kung fu bodies were good before the foundation was established. After all, they were a bit arrogant. Yu, confused, asks what the boy meant by that. Yi says that the natural sword body and the mixed birth are extremely rare merit bodies, because they are like two powers fighting for supremacy in his small personal world, dividing it into independent regions. And the way things were, if he did dual cultivation with just one person, he feared that the borrowed cultivation would be taken by one of the gong bodies. And as a consequence, the balance would be completely broken. Because of that, the outcome was obvious, as he would likely be killed. Hearing what he had said, the two girls are shocked, saying that if they thought about it, he really would explode, and it would be the kind of explosion that could not be saved with magic or immortal pills. The succubus then responds that it made sense because if he had such a strong dual merit method, he was still seeking to break through the realm overnight. Hearing what the two girls had said, Yi becomes very pleased, affirming that he knew from the beginning that they were sensible. However, Xiaoyu responds that high risk naturally comes with high reward. And Yi says that if the elder brother could successfully cross the realm, he would naturally be invincible within that same realm. Yi then says that they were completely correct, stating that it was not directed at anyone, but all he was trying to say was that all of them, there were 1 in 10 incomparable cultivators. However, his nascent soul and their nascent souls could not be compared. At that moment, Xiaoyu lands a kick on the boy, asking if it was just a natural sword body with a hybrid birth or if, in fact, he was the strongest in the world. He says that all of them had reached the top and for that reason should know all those things. And for that reason, he could swear that his proposal was only to combine their efforts to take down the enemy. And in no way was he desiring the girls' bodies. The two, in turn, become very irritated, questioning if that was really just about his lust, and shortly after, they end up beating the protagonist multiple times. Thus, time passes and the scene cuts to the two sisters sitting on a bed. The succubus, nervous, asks what they should do, and Xiaoyu responds that there was nothing else to do after all. She did not want to see that idiot's body explode. Yi responds that it would not be necessary, but Xiaoyu warns that no one else could do it. Then, Xiaoyu calls her sister, saying that she had only been lying before, but in reality, she did not understand that aspect at all. Hearing what the girl had said, Yi just smiles, affirming that he had known that from the beginning. But even so, there was no problem, saying that triple cultivation was still cultivation. So for that reason, they would work together. Hearing what her sister had said, Xiaoyu becomes embarrassed. Shortly after, the scene cuts to Yi, thinking that the beginning was so difficult because being repeatedly defeated during a realm breakthrough was indescribable. And because of that, he could even fall at that point. At that moment, Xiaoyu, along with Yi, calls out to the protagonist, asking what he was looking at since they should go to that place to perform a triple cultivation. At that moment, the protagonist throws some kind of cloth onto the mattress, saying that placing that sheet would increase the efficiency of his cultivation transformation for the 3 subsequent cultivations. Then he picks up a pair of pillows, saying that those would help as well. Ye, in turn, says that he had wondered why Master Zhu had only given him the sheet and the pillows. Then that had been given to the girl. Meanwhile, Xiaoyu was observing the situation. Shortly after, Yi picks up another item, saying that they needed soundproofing so as not to disturb others with the noise. Xiaoyu, in turn, is very surprised, asking if they could disturb the residents. And Yi warns that he had felt something was wrong from the beginning, questioning if his brother was a relative of the Hope clan, because once again he was familiar with their feats and also possessed their magical treasures. However, he responds that he was not because that screen had been openly sold at the treasure house at the time. As for the Kung Fu of the Hope sect, his sect's library already had a printed copy, and for that reason, she should not pretend to be ignorant because she must have read it as well. Shortly after, Xiaoyu throws her shoe at the protagonist's face, asking if he still needed to do the triple cultivation or not. Hearing what the girl had said, Yi remains silent and then responds that he still needed to. Thus, time passes and the group apparently begins the triple cultivation. And Yi asks if the protagonist's spirit was outside his body because it seemed very beautiful. Xiaoyu, observing the spirit, realizes that it was growing more and more. And the succubus, surprised, says that her brother was really talented because it was something she wanted as well. Meanwhile, Yi is very surprised, thinking that this was the feeling of not being limited by the power of pure yang. After all, he was feeling extremely free. Shortly after, Yi asks who would go first. Then, Shoyu responds that it would be her. Ye, in turn, says that it was still not too late, and for that reason, they should start practicing. Then he picks up the girl. A succubus, observing all of that, seems very surprised. Half an hour passes and Shoyu appears to be very tired. However, he says that there was no time to rest because otherwise, the cultivation would not work. Another hour passes and Yi then asks if Shoyu wanted to take a break. However, the protagonist quickly grabs the girl's arm, saying that time was running out, and for that reason, it was necessary to break through that realm quickly. Thus, time passes and the day had already arrived and the cultivation had apparently been completed. Meanwhile, our boy seems to be observing the girls. Shortly after, he starts to leave the room, beginning to analyze the view around him, thinking that after borrowing the cultivation of both, he could only reach the Golden Dan realm. Even so, he should forget about it because there was only a 3-realm difference from the little knight, and that was enough. At that moment, a light begins to cover the sky, and that door from before descends in front of Yi. Observing the situation, the protagonist says that it seemed the pursuers had already arrived at that place. Meanwhile, Xiao and Yun were observing the situation, asking the boy to be careful. He affirms that it will be over soon, so they should make a love-filled breakfast cake. About to start the battle, the protagonist questions why they do not take the fight to another place. The saint then agrees with that. At that moment, our boy snaps his fingers, once again summoning those swords from before, affirming that they would battle in the sky. At that moment, Yi begins to fly. Observing all that power, and the saint remains silent. And then she also starts to ascend into the sky, meeting the protagonist above the clouds. Meanwhile, he was observing the situation. Shortly after, he begins to prepare for battle, declaring that he, from the Mikuan sect, desired her sword. Meanwhile, Xiaoyu and Yun were watching the whole situation from below, wondering if, by any chance, that idiot was going to win. Her sister then responds that it was obvious because they were talking about her brother. Changing the subject, the girl says she was very surprised when she saw Xiaoyu so active during the second round at night, since no one would have thought that the great master of the Celestial Master House Xiao would have such a peculiar look. Moreover, anyone would kill to be in the protagonist's place. Hearing what her sister had said, Xiaoyu becomes very frustrated, asking her not to talk about it anymore, questioning how she could be in the mood for jokes and asking if the protagonist would really be okay. Because even though he had borrowed her cultivation, he had only reached the Golden Dan realm, but he was still 3 realms below that knight. The succubus asks her not to worry because, as far as she remembered, that little knight also had a sword, questioning if, when the protagonist had demanded the sword, he had ever lost. However, Xiaoyu responds that that had never happened even once. The succubus says that before ascending, Master Zhu stated that Yi should be the strongest sword cultivator without exception, and for that reason, he should not forget that. Moreover, the sword of the Xushan sect master Mu Bei was also the result of the protagonist's guidance. The 99 deadly swords stored together in Kunlun, since the world's strongest sword cultivator had done that. Therefore, there was no possibility of Yi losing that battle. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the saint, who was apparently struggling. Then he swings his sword at the girl, stating that her abilities no longer seem so powerful. The girl, irritated, asks who Yi was, since he was only of the Great Master class, but was still able to suppress the oppressive power of her holy art. Moreover, he shouldn't even be able to grab her sword. Hearing what the girl had said, Yi asks if she meant that the second strike would certainly land if the first attack missed. The saint, in turn, is very surprised, wondering how the protagonist knew that without anyone telling him. He says that strategy was easy to break because all he had to do was let the first sword scratch his skin a little. Moreover, he needed to talk about grabbing the sword, questioning if she had ever heard of the innate sword constitution. The saint then becomes very confused by what he had said, and the protagonist responds that, to put it in a way she could understand, he states that the boy was born to speak with the sword, and although it was his sword now, it still spoke very well with the saint. Hearing what the protagonist had said, the girl remains silent. Yi then starts laughing, saying that there was no need to continue that conversation. Observing the situation, the saint questions if he had seen through her movements. However, the protagonist tells her to continue because he was not forcing her to stop, saying that she should show him what kind of divine ability a high-ranking popesmite could use. The saint in turn becomes very irritated, saying that the boy would regret doing that. However, the young man responds that no, in fact, it was the opposite because he had been waiting for that the entire time. At that moment, the saint begins to chant a spell. Shortly after, her eyes begin to glow. Quickly, she starts reciting the incantation, and at that moment, a massive lightning bolt descends from the sky, directed at the protagonist, who then starts observing it. And at that moment, the scene cuts to inside a house that was apparently completely white. Meanwhile, Yi was in that place, wondering what kind of domain he had been pulled into. At that moment, the boy notices something as someone was standing in front of him, holding a sword. Then it is revealed to be an unknown person, who apparently looked like a god. Observing the girl, the protagonist wonders who that person was, assuming that it could be the one called the Son of God. Moreover, it could be the peak of the earthly immortal realm. Thus, the scene cuts to minutes before that happened. Meanwhile, Yun seemed to be preparing a potion. Shortly after, she applies it to her hands and massages it onto Xiaoyu's back, who then responds that it felt very good. The succubus, in turn, is very pleased with what she had heard, saying that it was the immortal potion passed down by her Makuin sect, along with its special massage technique. However, the idea was that Xiaoyu was very vigorous. Last night, it was obviously because it was her first time playing around, and for that reason, the girl had probably ended up with back pain. Shortly after, Yum responds that she had finished treating her back, and for that reason, Xiaoyu should turn around. The girl in turn becomes embarrassed, asking if that side was also important. Removing the towel, the succubus responds that, without a doubt, it was important, and for that reason, she should continue her massage. At that moment, a lightning bolt descends upon that place, and Xiaoyu, along with her sister, hears it. Then the two begin to look out the window. Xiaoyu says that the energy was not right because, even without their senses now, what they were feeling was very distinct, and for that reason, there was something much stronger. Observing the situation, the succubus agrees, affirming that there was clearly something in common at that moment. And for that reason, the two were unsure if the protagonist would really be okay. Shortly after, the scene cuts to that entirely white mansion from before. And meanwhile, Yi seemed to be fighting with that unknown person. Shortly after, his sword ends up breaking. Yi, in turn, seemed to be struggling with that, so he begins to observe the situation, realizing that none of his relics were working. Then that creature begins to speak, asking how a mere mortal dared to swing his sword at a god. Yi then becomes very irritated, saying that he was suffering great losses and that so many magical items had been wasted. Then that goddess approaches Yi, where shortly after she lifts her foot, asking him to kiss it, and for that reason, swear and submit to survival. And for that reason, he would be spared. Hearing what the woman had said, Yi is very surprised. At that moment, he begins to laugh, affirming that she was very good at telling jokes. But, as much as he loved continuing to undermine her authority, it would be better if she came to his bed that night, asking if he could teach her something. The goddess then says that she had spared Yi only because she had seen great abilities in him. For that reason, he should swear loyalty and take on the position of the Pope's knight. Hearing what the girl had said, Yi remains silent. He states that someone had already told him that before. For that reason, it would be interesting if the goddess ended up unexpectedly meeting that person. A flashback then plays, and the unknown woman asks the protagonist's name. Observing the boy, she says that he was incredible because the divine light of enlightenment dripped from his head. The muscles and bones of his body showed great experience. Meanwhile, the protagonist in his younger version seemed to understand nothing. Shortly after, the woman introduces herself, saying that her name is Lu and that she is the master of the Mushuan sect, and for that reason, it was a pleasure to meet the boy. At that moment, Yi starts running. However, the girl responds that it was really her, and for that reason, she was not lying. Shortly after, they begin to compare a photo with the girl to verify if she was really that person. Lu asks if the boy was not aware of the review of art and says that there was a clever demon. Time then passes, and the scene cuts to the two in another place. He asks what immortal cultivation does. Lu responds that cultivating immortality means relieving the body's restlessness and nourishing the spirit. Yi then says that it was like what the private school teacher said. Then Lu smiles and begins to stroke the protagonist's head. She says that, as the legends say, to the north lay an endless plain of snowfields, but of 4 seasons turned into winter, and even the eternal fire of the Holy Rama sect would die due to the absolute frigidity. Still, in such a dangerous place, there was a snow nation known as Japana. The people of this nation had completely transparent bodies. They endured the cold seasons, but were concerned with sunlight. For that reason, just one ray of sun was enough to turn them into mist, and the clearing would disperse their souls. At the eastern edge of the Dark Sea, there existed an abyss so deep that its bottom could not be seen. The reason for this was the existence of a giant beast from ancient times. It could devour rays of light all at once, but in the end, it was defeated by sages of the first generation. Because of that, it was unlikely to bring fortune to the world. Moreover, that world was extremely limited, and all the nations in the center of human civilization would rise one after another. For supremacy, strange desert beasts would also emerge, and the demonic race, which had been in seclusion for 1,000 generations, would rise. The primordial chaos of life and death in the spiritual world would also unfold among various other races and events. All of this would be excessively abundant, making it impossible to witness everything in a lifetime. Lu asked if he didn't find that incredible, and he responds that it was very interesting. Lu then questions what he would think if he knew that everything had been created by gods. He asks if that was a lie and if the gods were really that magnificent. Shortly after, Lu smiles and states that that's why she's going to meet those gods personally, because she wants to see if they are really as formidable as they claim. For that reason, she will just have to go through them, and if they are not so grand, she will defeat them. That was something she would do on her own. That was simply what immortal cultivation was about. The scene then cuts to the present. He questions why the golden core could not kill the earthly immortality. For that reason, he was still just a little boy. However, immortal cultivators were supposed to fulfill the celestial order of killing gods. With the sword key of the golden core realm and the sword intent of the peak mortal earthly realm, you could kill a projection of a god like that. For that reason, you should test it right away. At that moment, our boy makes a hand sign. The goddess begins to observe what is happening. Her gaze starts to shift. She says that this was very interesting, asking who the mortal was. Observing the situation, he is very surprised and realizes that this was no longer just a projection, but the consciousness of the divinity. He then says that it would be better not to change his name or surname because, in fact, he was her father. Hearing what the boy said, the goddess remains silent. Shortly after, she begins to laugh. At that moment, a beam of light pierces through the girl's head. She states that they will meet again face to face. Shortly after, that light begins to dissipate, and at that moment, that entire place begins to collapse. The scene cuts to the outside of that place. Meanwhile, the leader of the elves was watching the sky. Even that other slime was able to see the beam of light. Meanwhile, the protagonist's sisters were also witnessing it. Shioyu states that that idiot's sword was imitating the earthly mortal Kai. Surprised, she says that her brother was truly incredible, and it certainly seemed that the boy had won. For that reason, they should change clothes and welcome him immediately. Shioyu, irritated, asks who wanted to meet that idiot, and for that reason, if she wanted to go, she should go on her own. At that moment, the succubus begins to get ready. Observing the situation, Shioyu thinks that idiot must have suffered a lot, but even so, she didn't care about that. Shortly after, the succubus says that if Shioyu wasn't going, then she would go on her own. At that moment, the succubus begins to leave, but soon after ends up grabbing Shioyu's clothes. Then the girl had apparently already decided to go. However, she needed to change her clothes first. But at that moment, she realizes that they had disappeared, assuming that her sister had taken them. Moreover, that girl never actually intended for the two of them to visit the protagonist together. Shortly after, Shioyu opens some sort of portal, retrieving another piece of clothing. However, she is very surprised, wondering why there was only the outer cloak. Shortly after, the scene cuts to another location, where a girl appears to be falling. At that moment, someone ends up catching that girl. Then it is revealed to be Yi, who, meanwhile, was helping. Shortly after, he begins to observe the saint. Then he places the girl against the base of a tree, who then appears to be very confused about what was happening. He, in turn, points a weapon at the girl, who then begins to stare at him. At that moment, he throws his sword to the ground, stating that the saint should leave. The young woman, confused, asks why he was not doing it, since she actually wanted to subjugate him. In response, our boy just smiles, saying that she was acting as a judge, with a cold gaze and an iron fist, and for that reason, it seemed very exhausting. However, she had never taken a life, asking if he was right about that. Moreover, she didn't need to look so surprised because he had a friend who was very similar to her. She kept shouting non-stop about beatings and killings. However, she was the type of person who would faint at the sight of blood, mentioning that she hadn't said anything beyond judgment and judgment, but she held back when she fought against Xiao Yu alongside her sister. Her second sword clearly had the capacity to seriously injure Yun, but even so, she only scratched herself. Hearing what the boy had said, the saint remains silent, and the protagonist says that it was as he had said before because his sword had told him many things about her, affirming that the sword had said that the girl was reluctant to work for the saint. They say the world is a garden of flowers for the great king, and all their lives are, comparatively, summer flowers for him to pick. Thus, a flashback appears showing that saint apparently defeating someone, affirming that they should simply accept their judgment. At the same moment, an explosion occurs in that place. And meanwhile, an unknown woman seemed to be fleeing, thinking that she had just blown up the building and even so had let the girl go free elsewhere. Moreover, she had asked to change her name and never return, wondering if that knight was really on her side. Soon after, a scene cuts to a person opening their eyes. Then it is revealed that it was the woman whom the saint had subdued before, feeling very happy because her beloved had awakened. Right after, she realizes that her neck was intact. The man, surprised, asks if the girl had put his head back, and the woman replies that it was the man they had taught. Observing the situation, the young man says that it was not right, wondering how the knight had managed to keep him alive. Thus, the girl responds that that lady knight had not killed him. The man asks why the saint wished for them to escape, and the girl says that the lady knight surely understood. The man, confused, asks what it could be because, in the incident that exterminated the entire family, he had never harmed any innocent person, but only those who had mistreated him, thinking that it was not difficult to prove the truth through investigation with the saint's methods. However, the truth was that in no way would the saint leave them alone. At the same moment, the man seems to realize something, thinking that that saint had probably let them go without an explicit trial. Thus, the scene cuts to another flashback, where that saint was apparently being announced as the new knight of the Pope. The people, watching her, seemed surprised because that girl was very young, and for that reason, it definitely broke precedence, as she was the favored child of the goddess' daughter. And because of that, she got extreme luck in becoming the sharpest sword of the daughter of God. And for that reason, they should simply allow themselves to rejoice and welcome the newest knight. The saint in her thoughts said that she did not want to forget that, fundamentally, she was not just an agent because everyone was withered flowers to be picked. Soon after, the other girl says that she would begin the adaptation test for the holy arts, because the adaptation to divine arts was extremely high. and that girl is probably a prodigy. For that reason, she should be sent directly to the Pope. After all, she should become his knight. Again, the scene cuts to another place, where the saint was apparently very wounded, saying that she definitely did not wish to serve as the Pope's knight, for, in truth, she only wanted to return home. At that time, Asura was only 5 years old, and due to her lack of compatibility with martial arts, she had been forcibly taken by the Holy See, a young girl who was promoted to the youngest knight of the Pope. However, the true aspiration in Asura's heart was different. Soon after, the scene cuts to the present, with Yi saying that since she had never wanted it from the beginning, he wanted to know why Asura had still not left. Hearing what the boy had said, the saint remained silent, asking if he really was not afraid of that person at all. Ye, in turn, questions whether the girl feared that person. Asura says that bringing God's arrival meant removing her mark from her body, calling her to become a projection. And with the projection exterminated, she would no longer be able to be tracked through the imprint. Yi, confused, asks what the girl would do from that moment on. To which she replies that she had no idea, affirming that she had holy arts in her and through them they could track her. Soon after, he asks her to hand it over because he would keep her holy arts. Hearing what the boy had said, Asura is very surprised. And at the same moment, she ends up handing over her sword. He quickly takes it and places it in his portal, saying that by keeping it there would be no problem at all. Asura, in turn, ends up thanking Yi, who then asks what the girl would do in that place. Asura says that she had already been defeated and had also lost her holy arts, and for that reason, she could finally be able to return home and begin to cultivate. Time passes once again, and the scene cuts to our boy walking through the streets. Soon after, that succubus ends up meeting her brother, who then embraces her, affirming that he was truly incredible. Meanwhile, an unknown person appears and asks Yi to come closer. Yi, noticing that it was Shoyo, is very surprised, questioning why she was hiding in that place. But soon after, he realizes the reason, as the girl was almost undressed, and immediately after, she welcomes the protagonist. Once again, time passes, and Yi, along with his sisters, is already inside the room. Soon after, the succubus asks what had happened to the knight. Our boy responds that he had sent her to the farm because he had used his unparalleled swordsmanship to make her forget the disputes of this mortal world, returning her only to the most primitive and idyllic pastoral life. Furthermore, he had managed to restore her cultivation bases. Then Xiaoyu asks what he was thinking about in broad daylight, affirming that no matter how he put it, he should wait until nightfall. Hearing what Yi had said, Yun asks if that meant the boy was able to return her first. Xiaoyu in turn says that she could also do that. At the same moment, the two girls grab the protagonist by the shoulders, throwing the poor boy onto the bed. Thus, time passes once again and a new day arises. Soon after, Yi wakes up, obviously after a night of fun. Our boy looks to the side and seeing that Taoist robe thinks that it truly awakens a person to the point of not stopping. Then he starts getting dressed, thinking that his cultivation base had already returned. At the same moment, Xiaoyu also wakes up, asking the protagonist to wait, saying that her cultivation base should have returned. However, it was still at the foundation establishment level. Quickly, Yun wakes up as well, saying that she was in the same situation and asking how that was possible. Ye, in turn, remains silent about it, seeming very uneasy about the situation. Time then passes again, and Yi was explaining that the girl's cultivation bases had been destroyed by a sword. Moreover, he was facing the peak of the Earth Immortal Realm. For this reason, it would be almost impossible to win. Even so, they should not worry, because he would definitely restore their cultivation bases, and in about 1 to 2 months, they would be able to regain their realms. Hearing the whole explanation, Yun says that in the end, he never had cultivation bases to return, and Xiaoyu asks why he had practiced triple cultivation with them for an entire day and night. The protagonist, in turn, remains silent. Then he says that they never asked him to stop at any moment. Hearing what Yi had said, Xiaoyu becomes very embarrassed, starting to yell at the protagonist. Soon after, the scene cuts to a mountain, where two people seem to be entering it while a dragon was inside that place, starting to observe those intruders. The other boy says that the dragon was of legendary class and for that reason was very interesting. Furthermore, classification through fighting monsters was what he loved most. At the same moment, his companion starts casting an enchantment, managing to enhance the status of that other guy, who then draws his sword, saying that he was going to test the power of that creature, and for that reason, they should see who was truly fiercer. Then he begins advancing toward the creature. Thus, the mission is successfully completed. The young man taking the paper says that everything was confirmed, and for that reason, he was truly the most attractive and unconquerable hero. Moreover, the next destination was the city of Hyde, and the first thing to do was to plunder the shameless land. For this reason, he was going to seek the treasures and beauties of the city of Hyde. Soon after, the scene cuts to the protagonist's house, who then says that the moment had finally arrived to evaluate his treasures. Therefore, they should take a look at the treasures they had acquired so far. The first of them was the absolute celestial balance holy art, and the other two were sword spirits contained within it. Soon after, Yun mentions the pair of swords containing the power of rules, asking if her brother had truly claimed them. Ye, in turn, says that it was obvious, and for that reason, they should not forget who they were talking about. Then, Shoyu asks if the knight had really given that sword to him, wanting to know what the protagonist had done with that person. And Yi says that he had used his unparalleled sword skill to make her forget the battles of this mortal world, sending her to the farm. Meanwhile, Shoyu begins to imagine a scene in her head. Soon after, she ends up slapping the protagonist's face. He then becomes very confused, wondering if it was his unparalleled skill that had offended her, saying that, according to the knight, that sword still had the impressions of the daughter of God, and for that reason, if used recklessly, she feared they could be tracked. And because of that, she would keep it protected inside her spatial magic tool for now. Soon after, he begins to analyze the next treasure, revealing a type of unknown stone. Shoyu asks what that was. He asks if he hadn't mentioned earlier that he had decapitated an enemy at the peak of the realm, and for that reason, that was simply a fragment of that projection. Observing carefully, Yun says that there was indeed Vian inside that fragment, and Yi says it was a pity that his sword, at the time, was too strong, because only that small piece had been left behind. But thanks to the sufficient killing capacity of that sword, the opponent was caught off guard without enough time to leave safety measures. That fragment had already lost any capacity to evaluate or self-regulate, and for that reason, it was merely a passive energy source. Then Yun says that with their cultivation methods of taking pills or refining, it was unlikely that their cultivation bases would transform significantly. Yi then says that now that she had mentioned that, he wanted to know what would happen if this was humanoid enough, and for that reason, they could do something different using that stone. At that moment, that crystal begins to shine. Yi, confused, wonders what that was. And at the same moment, a projection of that goddess from before seemingly appears. And Yun, along with Xiaoyu, seems very confused, wondering what was happening. Yi, confused, asks if it was possible that it had been activated by sound. Soon after, the boy begins to observe the projection of that goddess, saying that despite being achromatic, that thing had 5 complete internal organs. Xiaoyu questions what he meant by that, and he asks what else he could mean by it because they could really use the pearl diving technique on that thing. And pearl diving, among all the methods he currently mastered, was the only one that could enhance the cultivation base at a higher rate than any other skill. For that reason, it was a stroke of luck because that way he could restore part of their cultivation abilities first. And because of that, he should use that skill on it. The two girls, observing that situation, remained silent, imagining what it would be like to perform that skill on that creature. Thus, apparently, they were not willing to do it. However, Yun says that she also could not do something like that. Soon after, Xiaoyu ends up looking at her sister, asking if she was crazy. And moreover, she shouldn't do that with a person she didn't even know. Observing the situation, Yi asks why they were so agitated, when his goal was quite simple, just to increase their cultivation bases. Moreover, that was not a person, as it could only be considered a puppet at most. But Xiaoyu replies that it was impossible, and for that reason, he should dive alone. Quickly, the boy ends up undressing, saying that he would take it and transfer it to the girl. She then becomes very irritated and ends up hitting the protagonist, saying that he should dive alone and then disappear. And for that reason, he shouldn't take her sight. He says that even if it was to improve the cultivation base, practicing pearl diving in front of an audience was a bit too much. And for that reason, he didn't expect Xiaoyu to have that kind of hobby. Hearing what the boy had said, Xiaoyu becomes embarrassed, stating that she was telling him to find a hotel alone and then disappear. Thus, time passes and the scene cuts to the protagonist in another hotel. He then begins to observe that statue, thinking that after a quick evaluation, he was assuming that there still existed a cultivation base of the concentration domain within those puppets. But considering his own situation, the nascent soul cultivation bases of Xiaoyu, along with Yin and Yang, had filled his body. However, with all that, he could only reach the golden core domain. And with that spark of a consecration domain cultivation base, it was estimated that his establishment base would progress only slightly. At that moment, he thinks that he should forget about it. As long as he didn't offend heaven and reason, he should just practice. Even so, it was a pity because he thought he could watch others performing that pearl diving skill. At that moment, the boy begins to undress, saying that he really should do this. At that moment, he grabs the head of that creature, saying that, as expected, things like pearl diving are very inconvenient. Even more so, he was going to do this with that dead thing, but still, swallowing it directly was much faster. At that moment, Yi begins to feel something. Soon after, that puppet ends up falling onto the bed, and Yi, meanwhile, seems to be spitting blood, thinking that he had really broken through his domain. Soon after, the boy begins to meditate, starting the enchantment. Thus, time passes once again, and he seems very exhausted, thinking that it had been suppressed. Moreover, it only elevated his domain to the consecration state. Otherwise, his body probably would have exploded. Even so, something was not right because the cultivation base, when transferring swallowing efficiency, was still better than the pearl diving technique. So he wonders why the transformation rate was so high for the cultivation base in that puppet, which stored only a single affinity. For this reason, he had really surpassed his two sisters. At that moment, a noise begins to come from outside that room. A girl seems somewhat embarrassed, saying that there were guests in that place. The guy, confused, asks what was wrong because, in fact, he was a hero, so he would demand his privileges to claim that room. At that moment, the young man ends up opening the door, coming face to face with the protagonist, who was shirtless. Meanwhile, that puppet from before was lying on the bed, and in addition, there was some blood that the protagonist had spit earlier. The boy, observing that, is very surprised, questioning what the young man had done with the daughter of God. Observing that situation, he is confused, wondering who had just entered. Soon after, he asks the guy to wait and begins putting on his shirt. Then he starts preparing an outrageous lie and with a smile on his face, asks if he could know who that person was. The boy responds that he was a registered hero named Jace, and that he was currently exercising his looting privileges. Moreover, the whole situation was suspicious, asking what Yi was doing and why he had a person like that in his bed. Soon after, Yi seems to look for something, saying that he had good things to present to the gentleman since they wanted to exercise their looting privileges. Thus, he asks the hero to contemplate that as that commoner possessed an ancient statue of immeasurable value beyond imagination. For that reason, there could be no more fitting offering for heroes who rid the people of evil. Starting to observe that statue, the guy looks confused, asking if it was really valuable. Then the other girl also begins to observe the statue, and meanwhile, a glow starts emanating from the small statue. At that moment, it ends up exploding, spilling a kind of liquid onto the other two, who then become very confused, wondering what that was. At that moment, our boy ends up disappearing, escaping from that group. Soon after, the scene cuts to the building where Yi was before, and at that moment, he ends up teleporting to that place along with that goddess, who meanwhile seemed very tired. Xiaoyu then starts mocking the protagonist, asking why he looked so weak, since he had only been gone for less than an hour, but was already out of breath. At that moment, Xiaoyu notices something, asking what he had done with that puppet, as he was actually bleeding a little. Ye, in turn, asks not to be misunderstood because, in fact, that blood was his. However, Yun is skeptical, saying that it was impossible for him to have become so exhausted to the point of spitting blood. Moreover, she was certain that an entire day and night would be very exhausting, as on that day, she and Xiao Yu could not even walk. Amidst that situation, Yi asks why they hadn't asked him to stop, since they were so desperate for their cultivation bases. Quickly, the two advance toward the protagonist, asking if he still dared to mention those cultivation bases. Amidst that situation, he begins to explain, saying that it was indeed his blood that was spit, but that was not the point because, in fact, he had just gotten himself into a big problem. Xiao Yu, concerned, asks what had happened. Thus, time passes and Yi explains everything. Xiaoyu asks if he was saying that he had been caught while working with that puppet, and that because of that, the person recognized him as the daughter of God. Yun then becomes very irritated, saying that they shouldn't leave any witnesses. But Yi asks her to calm down because that person's domain was not bad, and his identity made them even more vulnerable. Moreover, he seemed to be a registered hero, and for that reason, they could not get involved in that. Observing the situation, Yun responds that it was inconvenient, mentioning that registered heroes were generally not weak, and that they possessed divine weapons and a great number of privileges that made them quite difficult to defeat. And Yi says that moreover, their domains were too low and for that reason, they had few options. Xiao Yu in turn becomes very irritated, saying that all of this was the boy's fault. Amidst that situation, Yi says that, to summarize, they can only disguise themselves for now. Xiao Yu asks if he meant that skill he had used before on that night. The succubus says that their domains were so low that even the traces of fusion could be exposed when using that skill. Meanwhile, Yi seemed to be thinking about something, and at that moment he suddenly remembers, saying that this way they could solve everything because they only needed to embrace that tradition. Thus, time passes once again, and out of nowhere, Xiaoyu seems to be wearing a maid outfit, and that succubus from before also seems to be doing the same. Ye, observing that, looks very pleased. Soon after, they end up testing everything out. Xiaoyu, irritated, asks if that was what he called embracing tradition. However, he asks her not to blame him as it was Yun who had decided on that plan. And Yun says that a merchant and two maids was a suitable disguise. And since that kind of formation was very uncommon in that world, no one would suspect them. And as long as they strictly followed the maid's code of conduct, they wouldn't have any problems. Xiaoyu in turn asks what that maid's code of conduct dictated. And Yun responds that it was unconditional obedience and the fulfillment of their master's words. For that reason, they shouldn't forget who they were now. And currently they were maids who could not disrespect their master, asking the protagonist if that wasn't true. He then responds that if she was saying so, it was completely true. Amidst that situation, Xiaoyu says that she had no choice but to accept it. Thus, the two end up becoming maids. Yi then says that since the two called him master, it was better to accept him politely than to refuse him gently. Soon after, Xiaoyu punches the protagonist, telling him not to abuse it. Right after, a boy starts falling to the ground, and Yun quickly catches him in her arms, asking if her master, by any chance, was hurt. Ye, in turn, responds that it was hurting a lot. At that moment, Yun becomes very concerned, asking if Xiaoyu wouldn't mind using her Yahello pillow. Moreover, Xiaoyu could hit him whenever she saw the protagonist in such a comfortable state, mentioning that that girl was very rough, unlike herself, who felt pity and sadness for her master. Amidst that situation, Xiaoyu seems very irritated, telling him to stop with that nonsense. Yun asks why she should do that, mentioning that she was only teasing Xiaoyu and asking if by any chance she was getting upset. However, Xiaoyu says that there was nothing funny about that trick, asking who wouldn't be able to do that. Hearing what the girl had said, Yun falls silent, asking if Xiaoyu by any chance was capable of doing it. Thus time passes, and soon after, Xiaoyu ends up placing the protagonist's head on her lap, asking what he thought of it. He then responds that it was really great, and the view was even better compared to that succubus from before. At that moment, Xiaoyu is surprised by that and then starts hitting the protagonist, asking how great he thought it was. Soon after, someone ends up knocking on their door, and looking around, they say that that city of AIDS seemed to be very impoverished. Observing the situation, Yi says that it was the person who had been looking for him before. Quickly, Xiaoyu grabs an enchantment. She says that it seemed they couldn't avoid him in that place. Yan responds that they would have no choice but to see that person. At that moment, the man opens the door. He introduces himself, saying that his name is Jace and that he was there to exercise his looting privilege. Immediately, the man begins to observe the protagonist, who in turn seemed to be disguised with a mustache. Observing the boy, Jace says that he looks somewhat familiar. Amidst that situation, he seemed very nervous. However, Jace tells them to forget it since all the villagers looked the same. Still, he wouldn't give up on continuing his looting. Soon, he starts looking around, realizing that there was nothing useful in that place. Yun observes the hero and seems very irritated. The other girl, in turn, seemed embarrassed. Meanwhile, Yun was staring intensely at the girl. Jace, on the other hand, looked very frustrated, saying that everyone there was very poor and that there was nothing in the chests. He stated that Yi was really terrible. Then Jace looks to the side and says that looking more closely, the maid was actually very beautiful. Moreover, he had found a succubus girl, so he might as well take advantage of the situation. Then Jace called the protagonist, asking if he could hand over his long-haired maid to him. Hearing what the man said, the protagonist becomes extremely irritated. Jace then asks what he was doing, saying that it wasn't as if he wouldn't receive anything in return. However, with a smile on his face, Yi says that it would be difficult to do that. He explains that Jace should be fooled by her appearance, which seemed pure and clean when in reality, she was mentally challenged. He reveals that she played like a pig at night and became even more bizarre during the day, going crazy out of nowhere. Xiaoyu, hearing what the protagonist was saying about her, seems to get very irritated. She starts biting the boy, who then says that everything he had said before was true. Observing that situation, Jace remains silent. He says that it was nothing serious, as it was just a mental illness. He mentions that his companion knew how to cure it using magic, which would mean more money for the protagonist. Then he starts approaching the girl, asking her to follow him. But quickly, Yi grabs Jace and pulls Xiaoyu away. With a threatening look, he warns the hero not to touch her. The hero, in turn, becomes very irritated, asking what his problem was. At that moment, he smirks, saying that what he meant was that his maid was naturally very violent, so he feared the hero wouldn't have what it takes to control her. However, the hero responds that if he couldn't, he would try and try until he succeeded. At that moment, Xiaoyu jumps and delivers a double-legged kick to the hero's face, asking if he really thought he could do that. Observing that situation, Yun becomes very irritated, saying that she really wished she could do that to her brother as well. Then the other girl approaches the hero, asking if he was okay. She begins casting an enchantment, starting to heal Jace's wounds. Jace says that it was notably interesting since never before had a villager dared to treat him that way. Soon after, the boy waves his finger at the group, saying that in the name of what his father and mother had given him, through generations of heroes, he would definitely have that girl. Hearing this, he becomes very irritated. Soon after, a light descends from the sky, and a giant glowing sword appears, piercing through the building and almost hitting the hero. Confused, Jace asks what that was. Quickly, he grabs his sword, questioning why swords were falling from the sky. He states that it was not normal, so he thinks the hero should leave soon before one of the swords impales him to death. Jace then says that the man couldn't intimidate him. Then he approaches the other girl, asking if she had said that he was bothering her. Ye, in turn, tells the hero to stop joking, saying that he was just a villager. How could he have such audacity? Observing the situation, Jace becomes very surprised and asks if the girl had said he was speaking in riddles. At that moment, another person starts speaking, announcing that a legendary class monster alert had emerged east of the city. For that reason, they were extremely dangerous, and master-class adventurers or higher, along with heroes, were invited to join the battle. Jace, in turn, becomes very excited, saying that the time had finally come since one of the great ones have finally appeared. But even so, he wouldn't forget about the protagonist because of this. He bids farewell, saying that they would meet again to settle things next time. Quickly, Jace leaves that place, heading toward his next mission. Amidst that situation, Yi asks if they had already left. Then Xiaoyu appears, charging at the protagonist, demanding to know what nonsense he had spoken earlier. Yi, amidst that situation, says that it was just an act, so she should endure it for a while because everything would be fine in the end. But he had to confess that he had almost failed to hold himself back in the end. Unfortunately, it was a shame that the golden core domain stored within the clouds had been urgently forced out by the flying sword. Hearing what Yi had said, Shoyu becomes embarrassed, wondering if he was really angry because of her. Then she gets off with the boy, asking if he still dared to speak and saying that, for that reason, it was shameful. Meanwhile, Yun was observing everything, thinking that it was detestable, but that she had mastered that script, and for that reason, it would be her turn next time. Thus, time passes once again, and Yi says that, as expected, it had been mentioned that just a moment ago, those legendary monsters appeared nearby. Hiryu says that there were still 5 domains missing, and Yun responds that it was too risky, so they should increase their domains first before doing that. Yi, opening his portal, says that now that they had mentioned increasing the domain, they should guess what he had found inside the seal of the sacred domain. Thus, he ends up revealing an artifact called Mini Grotto, saying that even though it was just a low-level sky grotto, it was still beneficial for improving someone's cultivation base. For that reason, they should cultivate inside the Sky Grotto first because his consecrated domain was 4 domains below the legendary class. And for that reason, he again decided to take advantage of that accidental encounter. Observing that relic, Xiaoyu asks if there was something in common about that Sky Grotto. He says that she had guessed it because she should make sure not to make any kind of mistake. Soon after, the boy ends up grabbing that artifact, saying that now it was perfect and for that reason, he was going to face those legendary monsters. Soon after, the scene cuts to another location, and Yi, meanwhile, seemed to be appearing on those battlefields. And pleased, he thinks that he had really arrived just in time, but he should try to observe his surroundings. At that moment, an attack starts advancing toward him. However, the boy thinks that it wasn't so bad, and for that reason, he should test the new flying sword on the consecration domain. But at that moment, an unknown person suddenly appears, managing to defend against that attack. Then it is revealed to be Jace, who is very surprised, asking if by any chance it was Yi. Yi says that they had finally met again, asking if his face was still injured. Jace quickly questions what Yi was doing in that place because it was too dangerous, so he should return to the city and hide, because they should discuss the maid problem later. Soon after, an unknown being appears saying that it had gone to the city of Hyde, but its son had not yet returned. For that reason, it should release its son in that place and hand over the sacred artifacts of its kind. At that moment, Jace asks his companion to help him so she should enhance his attributes, because a formidable battle was about to take place. Thus, time passes and the scene cuts to another location. And Yun, meanwhile, asks her sister if she wants to rest for a moment. However, Kyoryu asks her not to worry about that, mentioning that Yi was not lying before as it was really easy to perceive that, because that Sky Grotto was one that depended on real cultivation in order to cultivate. Again, the scene cuts to the battlefields and Yi, meanwhile, was observing the heroes' battle, thinking that it was no wonder they seemed so familiar since they appeared to be from the Orc Prince's family. Moreover, he had no idea that the 9th Orc Prince had been in the Elf Village, wondering if he wanted to go straight to the city of Hyde. And for that reason, that lady certainly did not know that her son had turned into a pile of charcoal because of him. Again, the scene cuts to the battle, and the orcs seem to be launching an attack. However, Jace manages to defend himself, and as a consequence, he ends up being thrown far away. But even so, he manages to stay on his feet, thinking that it was supposed to be 2 against 1, but now that orc alone was actually the main attacker. And as for the smaller one, he was always at the rear, chasing with the wind blade. But even so, it was clear that until now, they had been holding back in that battle. For that reason, the brute strength of the legendary class was truly incredible. Yi, from a distance, was observing that battle, saying that the boy seemed quite excited, but he still couldn't say that his deductive skills were very good. On the surface, it looked like the bigger one was the main attacker and the smaller one was the support. But in reality, the smaller one was chasing with wind blades, and that was the biggest threat to victory. For that reason, the bigger one was the true support, and the one actually fighting was the smaller one. Even so, it was interesting because even though that boy couldn't understand it, his body responded without a second thought in battle. Because knowing it was important, he was aware that battle with a slight speed difference already had its limits. Besides the wind blade attack, which had helped him distance himself from that place before, because he had left all the space to dodge the seemingly light but small attacks, wondering if that was the result of his own intuition or even the instincts of his terrified body. That's why he wanted to know the profound secret behind that mere attack. Amidst that situation, Jace says that it wasn't good because resisting the enemies like that wouldn't lead him anywhere. Soon after, the boy calls out to his companion, telling her to restore all of his stats. For that reason, she should grant the strongest buff to his attack magic, because in fact he was going to use a single move to truly define his victory. Right after, the boy leaps forward, launching that attack toward the orc. Observing the situation, he is surprised, thinking that the boy had abandoned defense in favor of an all-out attack. That's why he probably wanted to destroy the terrain. Quickly, he pulls out the artifact, thinking that at least that collectible edition paper man from the Immortal Master could repel an attack up to the semi-god stage. However, the idea was good, but he was seeing it as if it were a chess game, because he was assuming that his enemy wouldn't attack as well. At that moment, he suddenly appears in the middle of that battle, thinking that wasting a collectible edition paperman from that immortal master was really annoying. Soon after, the young man manages to hold off that attack. And at the same moment, that foundation begins to collapse, and the group starts falling in free fall. Jace's companion, meanwhile, was observing everything. However, there was no time to think because one of the orcs had still managed to hold on. Thus, time passes and the scene cuts to another location. Jace, meanwhile, was still standing. Soon after, the other orc appears, saying that it was a good tactic, but even so, it was a shame, because in fact, wind magic was the best he had. Jace says that he had thought something was strange because it was obviously an orc. However, it was unusually small and in fact specialized in wind magic. For that reason, it was truly a distinct species. At that moment, that orc begins to laugh, saying that just as there were adventurers and heroes among humans, among the orc species, there were also such special types. Amidst that situation, Jace thinks that the matter was settled, and though his plan to destroy the terrain failed, at least he had created a one-on-one combat environment. Moreover, that creature was of legendary class, and for that reason it might be able to level up and kill him. So he was going to settle this fight without wasting time and then deal with that villager from before. Soon after, the boy starts casting an enchantment. The orc, confused, asks what that was, and then that guy starts casting a skill buff. The orc says that it was clearly the effect buff that the girl had used before and asks how he could release it on his own. Quickly, Jace grabs his sword, saying that he shouldn't underestimate the hero. Then he begins advancing toward the orc. The orc quickly starts chanting an enchantment, striking it at Jace. Time passes once again, and the battle continues. However, unfortunately, Jace had lost. The orc then asks if the boy really thought that such a thing as talent was reserved only for humans. For that reason, it was his incompetence. Then he throws the boy against a tree. The boy appeared to be seriously injured. The orc says that he could praise his disguise from before, but now with his talent activated, it was an absolute disgrace. For that reason, it was the end of the line for the boy. In reality, all this time he was actually a woman. The girl quickly asks the man to kill her. Then the orc approaches Jace, asking if it was she who killed the 9th prince. However, Jace responds that she doesn't know what he's talking about. The orc asks if she wasn't going to admit it. Then he gets even closer to the girl, saying that it was all useless because in fact she was going to die anyway. Even so, he was just waiting for her next reincarnation. Now with her bloodline and unique lineage, the orc was eager to give birth to the monster. At that moment, he appears in that place. The orc quickly notices the boy. Jace then asks him to leave that place because it was all too dangerous. However, the protagonist didn't seem to care about that. Wondering how such a good spatial magic weapon could have broken, both of them are very confused upon hearing what he had said. Then he begins to speak, saying that before he saw the Lord Hero as a solid rock, only now to see such big things. But it must be because they usually draw a lot of attention. Such inconveniences should be hidden beneath that magic armor. Hearing what Yi had said, Jace becomes embarrassed, saying that it wasn't that kind of magic armor. It was just something firm that she used to store those things because in reality she thought it would be a little reliable. Yi says that was expected from the Lord Hero, because that commoner admired careful calculation. However, the girl responds that it was nothing since it all came from a book. Yi, confused, asks if he could know more about that book, because that commoner would also like to experience reading it. The girl then begins to explain, saying that it was a classic work with a long history called The Humiliation and Forbidden Adventures of a Heroine. The two were very surprised by what they had heard. However, the orc notices something, asking why she was chatting as if he weren't there. At that moment, he begins casting an enchantment, but at the same moment, the boy asks the orc to stop. The orc, irritated, asks if he had 3 reasons not to kill that person. However, the boy responds that the best he could offer was 1 reason. And at that moment, Yi shows the artifact of his clan, saying that that commoner was aware of the king's search for his artifact, and for that reason, he was offering it especially to his highness, hoping that he would have mercy. Moreover, the artifact was not fake, and the king should be able to recognize it at first glance. Observing the artifact, the orc thinks that it really was the real one. Although it was a bit distant, its aura was unmistakable. Amidst that situation, the orc says that he was lucky to have survived up to that point. Thinking of bringing the artifact back and properly dealing with all of them, he decided to take the girl to another place, while the other soft-skinned man would be taken to be delivered to the clan elders. Soon after, the orc approaches his family's artifact. But at that moment, 2 unknown creatures appear. They start running away with that artifact in their hands. The orc, irritated, asks how they dared to toy with him. However, he notices that the protagonist had disappeared, but even so he forgets about that, stating that he should at least retrieve the artifact. Soon after, the scene cuts to a cave somewhere nearby. Yi, meanwhile, seemed to have teleported beside Jace. Soon after, he places the girl in the corner of the cave. She then thanks him for that, but the protagonist responds that it was no problem. The girl then says that there was no need for formalities, so he should just call her Jess. Moreover, she says that she was sure that he was not a commoner. Having no other choice, Yi responds that it was true. Jace responds that now he understood, because in desperation, she realized that he seemed familiar. With that white hair, pale face, and even the ability to save her from danger. affirming that he was one of the great heroes whose name was Jess, who, according to legends, had lived a reclusive life for many years, and for that reason, she had seen his portrait before. Hearing what the girl had said, Yi remained silent, responding that it really was him. However, he thinks that that person had already been dead for many years. And although he didn't know who she was talking about or what was implied about his identity, it should be enough to accompany her without any problems. Jace then says that, indeed, the two maid sisters beside him should be disguised allies. Ye, in turn, responds that that was exactly it. The girl says that even considering respect for elders, she could only think of absolute disrespect. However, he says that young people always take wrong steps here and there, so he understood the girl. But now he wanted to ask why she had insisted on that red-haired maid. However, Jace points out that few people would not want to have a dignified, long-haired maid. Not to mention that they should all be powerhouses to become allies. And since that long-haired girl obviously fought, she was already extremely strong, because the kick she had landed earlier was truly incredible. Then he starts to recall all the times he had been beaten by Xiaoyu, saying that she was truly a revered fighter. Soon after, the boy changes the subject, asking about her current condition. She then responds that she was doing fine and for that reason was still capable of fighting. He asks how many ribs had been broken, and quickly the girl responds that it was 10. But even so, it was still nothing. At that moment, he ends up pressing on the girl's abdomen, who then starts screaming in pain, telling him not to overdo it now because her talisman spirit wouldn't be able to hold that guy forever. And for that reason, he had to heal her quickly and start thinking about a counterattack. Hearing what the protagonist had said, Xiaoyu ends up agreeing. Yi says that he should explain in advance that although that kind of physical contact between men and women was a taboo, it was necessary. And since her wounds were concentrated around the chest, perhaps she would need to take on some sin so that he could heal her. Observing the situation, Xiaoyu says that she understood. Soon after, she lifts her shirt. Ye, in turn, is very surprised by what he had seen, asking why she was in such a hurry as she had been much more proactive than him. Xiaoyu states that it didn't matter because fighting and defending were her duties, and for that reason, it was trivial. Moreover, she had several privileges and conveniences, and because of that, it was the way of a hero. Hearing what the girl had said, he remains silent. Soon after, he says that he understands, asking the girl to lie down. At that moment, he begins casting an enchantment on his hand. Jace, meanwhile, watches everything in silence. He says that he would first apply a unique immortal solution to the wound. Moreover, his internal strength could force it into the body, allowing her bones to beat and healing themselves. And depending on the situation, closing her eyes would provide better verbal guidance. The girl then says she will do that, telling him not to worry about her. At that moment, he begins performing the enchantment, asking the girl who was hurting. She then responds that she was fine. Ye, in turn, apologizes, saying that it was because the wounds were very close to each other. However, Jace asks him not to focus on that spot because it was too sensitive. Thus, time passes. The girl then thanks him, saying that she now felt much better. He says that he was finished and that now, to deal with the wounds around the waist, it might be a bit tricky. Soon after, the boy begins analyzing the wounds, and Jace seemed to be in a lot of pain from it. However, in reality, she was feeling ticklish, slapping the boy's face, who then falls silent as his disguise is removed. Jace, observing that, is confused, saying that he was with the daughter of God that day. Ye, in turn, thinks that he is screwed. Jace is surprised, saying that the noble senior had shameful interests, but even so was to be expected. However, he says that wasn't the case, as it was just a mission. She couldn't know, but that was a cursed statue of the daughter of God. Jace says that his willpower would collapse and that they would feel as if their bodies were being enslaved. However, the boy responds that when he received his mission, it was precisely to remove that curse. Jace says that the item he had handed over before had been destroyed. He says that it was a sacred object to dispel the curse used to repel its effect. Jace then concludes that that was why the foul-smelling liquid had splashed on her. He says that he was helping to repel that curse and that, naturally, she had been distressed upon seeing it. If it weren't for the liquid, she wouldn't have been able to wake up again. Jace asks why the protagonist ran away afterward. Yi says that he needed to protect his client's privacy, and for that reason, it shouldn't have been watching him, since privacy was also very important, not just completing the mission. Jace, in turn, remains silent, saying that all of that made a lot of sense, and for that reason she was a fool because she still had a lot to learn about the hero profession. He then feels very relieved, thinking that the girl had really fallen for that story. Changing the subject, he says that they should really finish with that healing. Thus, time passes and the girl had apparently fully recovered, saying that she was now ready to save her companion. However, within seconds, she ends up falling to the ground again. He says that he had told her to take it easy because he had just reconnected her bones, and for that reason, the injuries were not fully healed. That orc's attack had been very strong, and for that reason, she shouldn't be deceived just because it was merely a legendary class enemy. In reality, the damage inflicted on her had been twice as strong as it should have been. Not wanting to talk, Jace says that she had to save her companion. However, he says that it was useless to be anxious when she couldn't fight back in any way. For that reason, she should carefully consider the current matters, first resolving the immediate crisis and relying on her guild friends and the adventurers to sort everything out. Soon after, the scene cuts to another location where someone says that in that great adventurer guild, they were the only ones who could take action, stating that it was fine if they were just aware, but now, some AD-11 had reported that an assistant mage had been chased into the forest, asking why they couldn't risk their lives to rescue the adventurers. The girl, hearing that, remains silent and then questions if he expected them to face legendary class orcs to rescue just anyone. At that moment, another girl appears, stating that she thought Leo was right because with so many reports from the players, it wasn't something they could simply ignore. The other girl asks if she was joking because those were legendary monsters, and for that reason, they couldn't just overlook the situation and defeat them. Moreover, high-class orcs had a racial berserk blood talent, and they would go into a frenzy if injured. So a team like theirs, even if they were 10, would only be seeking death. Still insisting, the girl says that they were a fully equipped 3-person team, and for that reason, there was no reason not to try. However, her companion says that everyone had already heard that the Lumen Forest was generally a high-risk zone. And because of the legendary class monsters that lived in it, the most likely scenario was that they would be dragged off by other creatures before even seeing Margot or the orcs. Not to mention that they could get separated if they insisted on going, and at least they wouldn't die in vain. Hearing what her companion had said, Leo remains silent, saying that he should forget about it, but still, he should be lucky to have her respect, and soon after, the other two begin heading to that place alone. At that moment, another girl opens the door, and then it is revealed to be Jace's companion, who, with tears on her face, begins pleading for help. Observing the girl, Leo asks if she was the assistant mage who had been chased into the looming forest, questioning how on earth she had escaped. The other girl, surprised, asks if the legendary class orc had started fighting another monster in the forest to the death. Completely terrified, Jace's friend responds that yes, mentioning that she had been chased by the orc in the looming forest until they encountered a legendary class earth serpent. And for that reason, the two fought until they mutually destroyed each other. Leo then becomes very surprised, saying that if he didn't know the girl better, he would mistake her for some kind of protagonist for having such luck. Changing the subject, the young man turns to the other woman, stating that it had been very unlikely, now asking if she was still willing to join them. Hearing what her companion had said, she becomes very embarrassed, but still, she ends up accepting the offer. Meanwhile, her other companion was observing that situation. Meanwhile, Jace's companion seemed very shaken, pleading to be able to rescue her companion, who then revealed that in reality, it was her brother. Thus, they debate again and quickly conclude that the legendary Orc King would be difficult to deal with, and because of that, the adventurers in the vicinity would venture out on their own. For that reason, the adventurers' assistants requested reinforcements from the Princess's Might Regiment stationed nearby. Soon after, time passes and the scene cuts to that forest, where that Andy's orc had apparently been defeated. The other serpent, in turn, had also met the same fate, and between them, a giant crater lay in that place. Again, the scene cuts to the cave where he was. Jace, meanwhile, was apologizing, saying that it was just an inconvenience for him in that state, and that, for that reason, his own companion was at risk. He says that for some reasons, he had temporarily lost his power, placing him currently at what he would call veteran class. At that moment, the girl begins to cry, saying that it should have been her instead of her sister. Because of that, it was a cruel fate. However, Yi responds that there was still a way to fix everything. Confused, Jace asks him to tell his plan, and Yi begins to speak, saying that he would use that method. But he would need something from her, stating that he knew he was asking for something very important, but he swore to return it later. But of course, she could refuse if she wished, though he couldn't imagine any other option besides that one. And if she was willing to agree, he promised to be gentle. Soon after, he was about to say that he wanted to take her sword, but at that moment, Jace asks if he wanted her virginity. At that moment, the protagonist becomes very confused, wondering why on earth that would be useful. Jace, in turn, apologizes, saying that it also said something like that in the book, and that, by taking it from some hero, an even stronger demon god would emerge. Observing the situation, he becomes very disappointed, asking if the content of that book was just that. However, Jace says that the demon god or king inside the book was exactly what the hero had transformed into. Right after, the protagonist starts changing the subject, saying that in short, he might have a chance to fight if she lent him her sword. Jace says that it might be possible, but she knew that he didn't know this, yet her sword was a bit special, as only she could use it, because it was as if the sword recognized its owner. Hearing all that, he ends up smiling, saying that she had the spirit of a particularly loyal sword. However, that didn't matter because he would make good use of it for the girl. At that moment, he begins chanting an incantation, and right after, his consciousness seems to be directed elsewhere. Our boy asks her to reveal herself, as he should try to foster mutual feelings with the spirit of the sacred sword. The boy, observing that spirit, seemed a bit confused, becoming very surprised by what he had seen, because that was not the spirit of a sword, nor the spirit of an item, but rather it was a creature, and in other words, what was really inside the sword was possibly a human soul. Right after, that spirit starts speaking, affirming that it had seen everything, and because of that, was very angry. Then that spirit starts revealing itself, taking on a kind of human form, and scarlet hair begins to emerge, and a beautiful woman appears, asking what he was doing with her daughter. Then it is revealed that the girl was the former heroine from before, who says that not even in the Book of Humiliation of the forbidden grand adventure of the heroine had something so daring happened. Right after, he asks her to wait, questioning whether that book by any chance was hers. The girl answers yes because she had given it to Jace. Ye, in turn, apologizes, asking if she really thought it was okay to give such a book to her daughter. The woman asks what the problem was, since it was a book rich in imagination and had an engaging plot, and because of that, the story was brilliant and extremely addictive. Yi, disappointed, states that was not what he meant, asking if she didn't think that Jace should be a bit older before being exposed to that kind of book. Right after, the girl's mother gets very irritated, asking if her daughter wasn't old enough, since she had even already surpassed the size of her assets. Once again, he is very disappointed. He says that wasn't what he was referring to. The girl says that he shouldn't even try to change the subject, asking what he was doing with her daughter. He responds that it wasn't what she was thinking. The girl, irritated, asks how he could do such a thing. Our boy responds that it was a misunderstanding. Right after, the girl's mother questions how he could just wash his hands of it and end it like that. She says that they were already at that level, and because of that, it could be something much more romantic. At that moment, the protagonist gets very irritated. He says that she was saying those things about her own daughter. The girl then says that what he had said was also true, and despite everything, her daughter was still very young. If that was the case, she should take her and treat her with more passion. However, he says that he did not want that kind of situation. At that moment, the girl falls silent. She says that he had really passed her tests. It seemed that temptation, up to that point, had not worked. Yi, confused, asks how far she intended to go. The girl, with a melancholic look, asks how far. She starts drawing conclusions, and at that moment begins removing part of her shirt. Right after, he closes his eyes. He says that the world of the sword was treacherous, and that the heroine had probably never seen anyone enter it. Because of that, he was aware that he had disturbed the heroine's peace and tranquility. For that reason, he would leave immediately. Hearing what Yi had said, the girl remains silent. She says that it seemed he really was a knight. Our boy questions whether she was still trying to seduce him, so there was no need to do that. The girl's mother asks why she shouldn't do it. After all, she would entrust him with her existence, which was the most important thing. At that moment, her scarlet hair begins to glow. The girl responds that she would begin the next test. He asks whether that fire in the world of the sword was real because it didn't seem like something merely conceptual. Right after, that fire begins rising to the sky. The girl, with a threatening gaze, starts observing Ye. She asks if he really thought he could do those things with her daughter without suffering a punishment. Observing the situation, Ye remains silent. He thinks that she really was the Lord of Fire. Right after, she begins unleashing a series of attacks on the protagonist. She says that the sword clearly didn't seem to be a high-level tool, questioning how the conceptual flame could ignite within that world of swords. Right after, the girl hears what the protagonist had said, asking what he was doing with her daughter. Ye responds that he was not referring to the mother of the heroes. It was a misunderstanding, and for that reason, she should try to understand him. At that moment, the girl becomes very irritated. She says that he made her daughter take off her clothes and smeared her with something sticky. Because of that, he had humiliated her before her eyes. Amidst that situation, he becomes very desperate. He says that he was only helping her heal. However, with those excuses, he only makes the girl's mother even more irritated. She asks what the power of the sword he wished to use was. Right after, she unleashes an attack on the protagonist. However, he manages to defend himself with his swords. That fire was still extremely hot. That meant her sword was far superior. Right after, the girl's mother says that she should show the true aspects of the sword. She launches a massive attack toward Yi. He then says that he had made up his mind. For that reason, there was no need to do anything foolish. At that moment, the girl is surprised and a giant shadow appears above her. She is utterly in disbelief at what she is seeing. Our boy says that in the world of the sword, intent is the sword of the king. A shard of sword intent is a shard of strength. For that reason, he was untalented, but he had an innate sword constitution. With the peak of her intent at the height of earthly immortality, it was as if he possessed an arsenal domain of 99 immortal swords. He asks if she didn't think it was foolish to summon him to that kind of realm, because in reality he had total control over everything there. Once again, the scene shifts to the cave where Jace and the protagonist were. Meanwhile, our boy seems somewhat apprehensive. He was meditating while holding that sword. Jace at the same time was also observing the boy. Right after, she approaches him, thinking that he was the greatest ancient hero called Justice, mentioning that the portraits conveyed something different. However, he was still much more handsome. Even having lost most of his power, he continued choosing to act incognito on the front lines, bringing completely new concepts to the practice of servitude. For that reason, it was expected that he would be her role model in life. But at that moment, the girl seems to think of something, wondering why her companion had not returned to meet her senior as her master, wondering if that could really work, and besides, the senior was so powerful that he wouldn't accept her as his apprentice, supposing that she should wait for her mother to return and make her speak well of her. At that moment, the girl ends up remembering something, stating that she had now stopped thinking about it, because in the portraits of the ancestors, that person never had that black lock of hair. At that moment, he begins to open his eyes. realizing that the girl was in front of him. But at that moment, the boy begins to lose consciousness. Thus, he ends up collapsing on top of Jace. Once again, our boy wakes up, wondering what was happening, supposing that he had not yet left the world of the sword. Moreover, he wanted to know why everything was dark, and he couldn't even breathe. Right after, the boy tries to grab something in front of him, and at that moment, he ends up getting up. Then Jace calls out to Yi, stating that it was very embarrassing. Quickly, the protagonist withdraws his hands, saying that it was not his intention. Right after, Jace asks if everything was okay because he seemed extremely exhausted. Yi mentions that he had tried really hard, but even so, he was fine. Right after, the boy begins to give some advice, saying that there is always a moment in a man's life when his abilities are insufficient. And for that reason, there was no need to show off. At that moment, he becomes very irritated, questioning what that meant and whether, by any chance, she was doubting his abilities. Moreover, she should have some idea of how difficult that had been. But at that moment, the boy starts thinking about something, saying that she should trust him, because in reality, he really was fine. The girl, worried, asked if he hadn't said that he was stuck in the veteran class. And if that was the case, he was nowhere near what he had been at his peak. Moreover, if the boy was being forced to help, she was feeling very ashamed of herself. Yi says that putting it that way, it wasn't so bad, as he just saw it as if he were going through casual encounters. Right after, Jace asks about the sacred sword. Yi, in turn, says that it had not been a problem at all, and because of that, he was now able to wield it easily. The scene then shifts to the forest, and meanwhile, that other orcs seem to be chasing after those spirits from before. Meanwhile, the orc was about to get his artifact. However, at that moment, he suddenly disappears for some reason. The guy is then very surprised. At that moment, he appears at the scene, asking if the orcs still hadn't taken it. With a threatening look, the orc realizes that the protagonist was after him. Right after, he ends up launching an attack in his direction. However, Yu was no longer the same, and at that moment he uses that sword, invoking a giant blast of fire, easily avoiding that attack. The orc, surprised, asks if the wind was on fire. Meanwhile, Yu was approaching with that magnificent sword. The orc says that the sword obviously never had that much power, asking who the hell the boy was. To which he responds that he was an ancient hero whose name was Justice. However, it was obvious that it was just a lie to deceive him, saying that according to the previously established agreement between the woman and himself, he should allow him to say a few things before his beheading, mentioning that while the world was distracted, his crimson was eternal in the cosmic mind. And that sword belonged to Rennie's, so he should remember that name in his heart. At that moment, our boy begins chanting an incantation, launching it toward the orc. Once again, the scene shifts to the cave, and Jace seemed to be standing in a corner, remembering he asking her to just stay there so that he wouldn't have to worry about her. Thoughtful, the girl wonders if her senior could be in danger. However, she should not worry about that because her senior was the most powerful. Once again, the scene shifts to the previous battle, and that orc, meanwhile, seemed to be severely injured. Before him stood the protagonist, who then began to observe him. The orc, in turn, asks him not to play the hero, and for that reason should wait. Starting to make up a huge excuse, he says that he never wanted to be a duke, and that it was entirely due to his special lineage, that his clan treated him as a breeding beast, forcing him to reproduce with different female orcs day after day, and for that reason, he should be given another chance. Ye, ignoring everything, says that it was nonsense, asking if he shouldn't explain his special abilities first. The orc in turn says that his special lineage talent was Venus Assassin, which had a double effect on women. For that reason, if he were mercifully accepted, he would prove that he was useful. Ye in turn says that there really might be a useful ability in him, and for that reason, he could not waste it. At that moment, our boy begins to perform some kind of incantation. Right after, he grabs the orc's head, saying that the place he was going to had no return. And at that moment, both of their bodies begin to glow. The orc, in turn, starts to feel something different. And at that moment, a massive light begins to engulf him. Within seconds, the orc seemed to have taken on some kind of spiritual form. Right after, he summons his portal, placing the orc's spirit inside it. Thus, he had apparently imprisoned that creature. Then the scene shifts to another location. Xiao Yu, meanwhile, seemed very apprehensive. She asks them not to worry, saying that she might have misinterpreted the situation. Irritated, the other girl says that she wanted to kill the protagonist as soon as he left that place. Yun asks her not to be angry. She says they should take a better look because they might have misunderstood what they had just seen. At that moment, the portal appears at the scene and part of that orc's body emerges. Xiao Yu, along with Yun, is very confused about what was happening. The other succubus is confused, questioning whether her brother also loved that kind of thing. For that reason, she was very irritated. She states that he shouldn't have gone that far. Right after, the scene shifts back to the previous cave. Yuan, meanwhile, seemed to be returning there. He tells the girl that he really had returned. Jace, happy, says that he was really very strong. Yuan responds that she was very close. Without wasting time, Jace says that they should rescue her companion. However, the protagonist says that he had just met a group of adventurers and asked about the situation regarding the search and rescue, mentioning that they had said that her companion had already returned to the guild. Jace starts crying, stating that she was very happy because her companion seemed to be safe. It was just as she had imagined because her teammate was very strong. At that moment, Yuan becomes very irritated, asking how he still managed to find ways to give himself all the credit. In response, Jace simply gives a smile. Yuan thinks that, aside from all that talk about the hero's fragility, she really wasn't a bad person, and for that reason, it was time to fulfill the agreement. Right after, the girl seems to want to say something to Yuan. Meanwhile, he also wanted to talk about something. Thus, both end up speaking at the same time. Yuan asks if she wanted to accompany him, and the girl asks if she could consider him her master. The two, right after, become very confused. The girl quickly accepts the offer. Thus, time passes after much discussion. Amidst that situation, Jace asks what trials would be necessary for her to become a formal disciple. Yuan, in turn, becomes thoughtful. He says that there were no trials and that she should simply remember to call him master from now on. The girl is then very surprised, asking if she did need to have her body examined and warm his bed in some way. However, Yuan responds that there was no need for that. He says that a master teaches and eradicates doubts, and for that reason, a master is a man of word and action. And for that reason, that kind of ritual did not exist. Hearing everything, Jace seems to understand. Right after, the protagonist pats the girl's head, stating that it was already enough. But at that moment, he ends up remembering something, stating that there was another problem, and for that reason, she should keep in mind that her life could be at stake. The girl, confused, asks why. Yuan reveals that the problem was related to her two friends. Once again, time passes and Yuan seemed to be holding that relic from before. He asks Xiao Yu, along with Yun, to come out of the relic. At that moment, the relic begins to glow. The two sisters end up emerging from that place, where apparently they were wearing little clothing. The protagonist, surprised, was observing the scene. Jace, meanwhile, was also watching everything. Amidst that situation, the protagonist simply makes a gesture with his hand, stating that their hairstyles were very beautiful because they really had good use. Irritated, Xiao Yu asks what he was doing. At that moment, she strikes him with lightning on the head, causing him to fall to the ground. Then the protagonist reveals that there was a new disciple. At that moment, Jace introduces herself. She states that she was wishing a good day to her master's wives, and for that reason, she owed them an apology for her reckless actions. She should be forgiven. Right after, Xiao Yu asks her to wait, asking who she was calling that guy's wife. Jace, confused, says that her master had clearly said so. But at that moment, the girl says that she had understood the situation. And at that moment, she starts talking to Yun. She introduces herself, saying that she was also greeting her master's wife. Yun, embarrassed, says that she was a very smart girl. As a welcome gift, she should receive that precious tome from the master's wife, recently copied by hand. Observing the situation, Xiao Yu asks them to stop that. She states that, after looking more closely, she could see that her physique was generally good, and for that reason, without a doubt, she was a genius. Thus, she could also be considered her master's wife. Right after, Jace approaches Xiao Yu, saying that she would accept that. Observing the situation, the protagonist feels very relieved, thinking that it seemed he would live to see another day. Once again, time passes, and Jace, meanwhile, seemed to be looking at that book, very excited about what she was seeing. Behind her was that relic from before, and Yi, along with his two companions, was on the other side. And Xiao Yu says that she still needed to settle things with him and that he should continue explaining about his new disciple. Yun asks if that disciple could be considered a genuine disciple of the Mikuan sect. However, he responds that it was a long story, stating that they had encountered a legendary class orc not long ago, and that since he had to rely on the hero's sword's power to defeat him, he never thought that the sacred sword would contain a spirit within it, but rather a human soul. And after some time, he had asked for her to lend him her strength. However, something unexpected had happened. At that moment, the scene shifts to another location where a story was apparently being told, with a voice saying that her name was Rini Xiao Yu, a sub-sync class heroine who led a regiment of crusaders against the Lord of Shadows. However, with the extreme power of the Lord, they had no choice but to take him down with them. Then her husband, the Saint Mage Antonio, spent his last breaths trying to preserve her soul within the sword. Side by side, her sword and her travel bag were taken directly into the hands of her daughter. And at the very least, she would have her mother by her side while she grew up. That was why those were his last words before he was killed. And the sword that was transported was exactly the sword that the girl wielded now. However, in her bag, there was only a book that he had placed there before. The protagonist, surprised, says that she should have given him better equipment. And the one responds that that was her favorite book, and for that reason, she wanted her daughter to be able to see it as well. Yi says it was fine because now he knew what the book's content was. Otherwise, he would have mistaken it for sacred material. Right after, the woman says that it wasn't the book, but the sword, because the indomitable sacred sword, Lord of Fire, had always been a sacred artifact. And that was why the Lord of Indomitable Fire was also known as Flame Artifact A17. Unlike the few orc artifacts, there were countless artifacts that wielded the power of fire, and that sword had the codename A17. Observing the situation, the protagonist says that, as far as he knew, the Holy Faith was collecting sacred artifacts. The girl responds that as long as she was present in the sword, she could hide from the aura it exuded as a sacred artifact. However, after so many years, her strength was nothing more than a candle flickering in the wind, and for that reason, she feared that if she used all her power again, she might end up disappearing. And Yi says that without her presence in the sword, the essence of the blade as sacred matter would be exposed, and the Holy Faith would go after her daughter. However, as he had heard, the Holy Faith was not allowed to interfere when it came to legitimate loot obtained by registered adventurers. The woman says that was just nonsense because killing someone and taking the sword was not difficult to cover up, and for that reason she was willing to offer him her strength, but she had two conditions. The first was to make sure to engrave the name of that sword in the enemy's mind just for her pride as an adventurer, and the second was to accept her daughter as a disciple and protect her until she grew up. Hearing what the woman had said, he asked if she wanted him to swear to take good care of her daughter before even lending him her strength. The girl responds that it was true. He quickly begins analyzing the situation, asking if she realized that she had put her daughter in danger by refusing to lend her strength. Therefore, helping him was an absolute necessity, questioning whether that wasn't the kind of deal that weighed in her favor, unless she had planned to give him something good from the start. Bursting into laughter, the girl says that she knew he would have figured it out from the beginning. However, it seemed that the old hermit was truly an incomparable master, a mysterious hermit who taught Antonio how to bind a soul to a sword. When they met by chance, she was the one who took the initiative to teach them the technique. Then she created hallucinations and a reminiscence of prophecies. For that reason, she says that when he encountered a danger more terrifying than death itself, he would come across a man like him, who had white hair, an imposing posture, and whose lascivious nature was part of his character. Hearing that explanation, our hero remains silent, and the woman, continuing to speak, says that the hermit had said that there was no way he could refuse if he heard her name, that she had passed herself off as Luxie, who apparently was someone he knew. At that moment, our hero is very surprised by what he had just heard. The woman says that the girl was truly incredible, as she had even predicted his surprised expression. But in any case, she still had additional comments to pass on to the boy, saying that things were very complicated, and for that reason, he should not try to seek her out before reaching the Ascension realm, and that fate would make sure they met at some point. Hearing all that explanation, our boy remains silent, saying that he understood the situation, and for that reason, he would help her. At that moment, the girl seems apprehensive, saying that if possible, he should not reveal that to Jace. However, the protagonist says that as far as he knew, the archer heroine Hennessy was still active on the front lines as always. Because of that, her adventure had not come to an end. Hearing what the boy had said, the woman is surprised. However, in response, she ends up thanking him for everything. At that moment, our hero ends up invoking that artifact. Thus, the scene shifts once again to the present, with Yan saying that for a long time, only the sword had accompanied him, saying that it was a shame and questioning whether they shouldn't take care of the heroine together. For that reason, she should be the best wife and master could have. Hearing all that conversation, Choyu becomes embarrassed. Right after, the protagonist, along with Yan, turns his gaze to the girl, who then starts crying, saying that the whole story was very sad, and for that reason, from now on, she would also take care of Jace. Right after, Eon starts discussing the issue that her master had mentioned. Choyu says that now that they had ascended, that girl was probably there too, asking if they should go after her. However, Yi responds that according to Luxie's words, they should not do so at the moment, because she had said that things were very complicated, and for that reason, it wasn't that simple. Mentioning that there were many powers there based on his current experience, and that, for that reason, the influence of the factions was confusing. For that reason, his immediate goal was to become stronger and stronger. Choyu asks if Eon would continue accepting adventurer missions. Our hero then responds that yes, saying that they could form a more serious team now that they had also increased their numbers. But at that moment, Eon raises her hand, stating that there was a problem, because she used to act alone before and in fact was an undocumented succubus, which meant that she had not yet obtained official certification, making her activities in the Adventurers Guild quite problematic. And for that reason, she intended to go to the Succubus Inn to finally get her license approved. Once again, time passes and the scene shifts to the Succubus Inn. Our boys' group seemed to be at that place and was very surprised by what they were seeing. Yi, embarrassed, asks the girl if she knew places like that. Choyu, confident, says that she went there all the time and for that reason would show them the way. At that moment, Choyu ends up bumping into someone, and the monster asks if it was her first time there because that was the staff entrance and visitors were invited to go through another area. At that moment, Choyu leaves that place, embarrassed. Right after, the scene shifts to another location, apparently very luxurious, and a group of beautiful women seem to be introducing themselves, saying that their succubus sisters would fulfill all their wildest desires. The group watching that seemed very surprised. Right after, a succubus jumps in, telling Jace that her sword was big and asking if it was her first time as succubus in. At that moment, Jace becomes very irritated, saying that she couldn't play with her sword like that. Right after, another girl approaches the protagonist, saying that the guest seemed like a man of many secrets, and for that reason, should let them serve him together. Observing that situation, Shoyu seemed very irritated. But right after, another succubus appears behind her, asking if it was her older sister's first time at that place, and for that reason, she should be gentle with her. Amidst that situation, Shoyu seemed very embarrassed, thinking that she had been called an older sister. Meanwhile, Yun was watching everything, saying that they had misunderstood, because they had not gone there to visit the inn, but to take the evaluation since she wanted to be tested and obtain a succubus license. The other girl says that it was a coincidence because the president of the Succubus Society was at their small inn for an inspection, and for that reason, they could simply ask her to evaluate personally. Yi then becomes very confused, asking if a president really existed. At that moment, another person appears, saying that she certainly did not expect to find new talents to evaluate during her inspection at the inn, so her humble servant should not refuse to take on that responsibility. Right after, the president stands next to the other two succubi, and then it is revealed that she was actually very small. Yet in turn begins to observe the succubus, who then says that, according to her race, her appearance created illusions, and for that reason, they should particularly emphasize the understanding of human emotions. Her main ability was divided into two parts, and the first was knowing how to read the deepest depths of the heart, being aware of its desires. For that reason, it required excellent observational skills along with a certain level of psychological mastery. The second part involved any form of expression she would use, such as advanced provocations or even visual stimulant, asking if they, by any chance, had understood that. However, the group apparently ignored the entire explanation. The president then becomes very irritated, saying that they should listen carefully to the words of their humble servant. However, she realizes that it wasn't making any difference. Right after, she begins to change form. Ye, in turn, is very surprised because the woman had simply taken on a human form, which, by the way, was of great beauty, asking if they weren't going to listen to her explanation. Our hero, in turn, is very surprised, saying that that monster was huge. And the succubus asks if her brother really liked them big. He says that since childhood he had been destined by the patriarchs to safeguard morality and exterminate demons like her. However, was she a monster he was supposed to connect with? The president says that she found him handsome and that it would really work for her to serve him personally. However, he says that he couldn't do that because he didn't want to go to hell. But if she thought she could send him there, she could try. Right after, Shoyu appears irritated, telling the protagonist not to test the limits. Once again, time passes and the president asks who was participating in the evaluation. Yun then responds that it was her. Observing the girl, the president says that she had a fabulous aptitude. Right after, she approaches Xiaoyu, asking about that girl. However, Xiaoyu responds that she wasn't a succubus. The president says that it was a shame because with that beautiful face and graceful figure, she would be very successful with men. Observing that situation, our hero remains silent, imagining a scenario where Xiaoyu was a succubus. However, he says that some things were better left undesired. Then the president says that the duty of a succubus was to take the client's dream and transform it into a personal experience. For that reason, everything happened through dreams and had nothing to do with reality. Therefore, it was a very healthy process. However, since they were going for an evaluation, they would need to adopt a scoring standard, asking how they could rate that dreamlike experience. Then she takes out a kind of relic, stating that the meter would display a direct score from 0 to 100 based on the guest's experience. And the higher the score, the better the experience provided by the person. However, they should stop talking, and for that reason, they would begin a demonstration. Right after that, succubus ends up picking Jace as the test subject. Then she closes the curtain and various things apparently start happening behind that place. The meter then registers 85% lust. Then the curtain opens and Jace apparently looks very disheveled, as it had been too much pleasure for her. Right after, the protagonist asks how they dared to leave his disciple in that state, and for that reason, he would personally face them. Once again, Xiaoyu interferes in the situation, punching the boy on the head. The president says that if the protagonist couldn't participate, she wanted to know who would be the next target for evaluation, asking if Xiaoyu by any chance would participate. The girl then seems very apprehensive, becoming extremely embarrassed by what she had just heard, saying that she wouldn't be manipulated by them in any way, and for that reason, you should go in her place. The boy, determined, says that eliminating and subjugating evil spirits was his duty. Right after, another succubus ends up picking up the protagonist, and then she closes the curtain. The succubus, in turn, asks the protagonist to instruct her well, and right after, everything happens. However, the lust meter registers only 33%. The president, seeing that, is very confused. At that moment, the curtain opens, and he seems disappointed, questioning if that was all that was supposed to be so special. Hearing what the boy had said, the president becomes very irritated, saying that the two succubi should go together at once. Right after, the two do as their president had ordered. However, the result was only 55%. The president, seeing that, is very surprised. Yeah, right after, comes out from behind the curtains, asking what was so good about a duo. After all, there shouldn't be a scene that an immortal had never seen before. Right after, another succubus presents herself to the president, who then becomes very irritated, asking where exactly his interests lay. And for that reason, all four should go together. Right after, the curtain closes once again. and all the succubi had apparently gone to help the protagonist. Thus, the meter had risen to 77%. Yi says that what was good, but even so, something was still missing. Right after, the president slams the table, very irritated, saying that this was impossible. The 4 high-level succubi couldn't handle him. For that reason, she herself should take the initiative. Right after, Yun places a hand on the girl's shoulder, asking her not to forget about her, as she was the one being examined that day. The president questions if she was so confident in the result. Yun says they should give her a chance. After all, she was a novice. Having no other choice, the president ends up accepting, saying they would see what would really happen. Then the curtain closes. Meanwhile, our hero seemed to have his eyes closed. Upon opening his eyes, he is confused, saying that the exams were supposed to be for Yun, so he wants to know why Xiaoyu had gone as well. However, the girl asks him not to play dumb, because that kind of thing required her to have her perfect point of reference. That way, they could make things much more interesting. Yun, in the physical form of Xiaoyu, asks what the protagonist thinks of that. At that moment, he is very surprised by what he had seen. Time passes, and the meter had apparently exploded from too much lust. Right after, the president opens the curtain, very surprised by what she had seen, where apparently she was also wanting to have some fun. Once again, time passes. Yun steps away, meanwhile, asking if that was really happening. Yun had finally managed to pass the test. The president congratulates Yun, stating that she had obtained the special certification from the Haiti Province Society. With such an exceptional performance, they could provide her with a high-level license. Additionally, Yili gives a gift for Xiaoyu's brilliant charm, which was from the Haiti Succubus Province, so she was congratulating Xiaoyu as well. She had also earned their unanimous approval. Hearing all that, Xiaoyu remains silent. Embarrassed, she says that she wasn't a succubus. The president says that being a succubus wasn't just about having desire among the species. It was also about having the temperament, the voice, and the spirit. For that reason, they had completed their evaluations together. The results were obvious to everyone. Mentioning that they hadn't seen the thermometer explode like that in years, it was truly a waste that they weren't recognized as succubi. However, everyone has their own aspirations. Her sister knew she couldn't persuade her, asking if she should perhaps pass the bill to her to pay. The group then becomes very confused by what they had just heard. The president reveals a note where, apparently, all those dreams had cost some kind of money, and the total was 21,000 gold coins, asking how it would be paid. Observing the entire situation, Yi remains silent. Right after, he starts to run away. However, he can't do so because those succubi end up blocking the protagonist. Our hero approaches Xiaoyu. She then becomes very irritated, asking if he was planning to ask for money. Right after, he wakes Jace up, telling her that she definitely had to save her master. Time passes, and Jace apparently looked very frustrated because not a single coin in her money was left. At that moment, an unknown person appears at that place. It is revealed that, in fact, it was Jace's companion, saying that she had finally found her and questioning why she was in a place like that. Quickly, Jace says that she was going to get the girl at the Adventurers Guild, asking what had happened. The girl says that, to her surprise, a master-class monster had appeared outside the city. Observing the situation, our hero thinks that there was another monster in that place. Then the other girl says that they should prepare to fight it. Jace, accepting, says she would call her master and his wives to help them. She whispers into the girl's ear, who asks if they couldn't go alone, as a master-class monster was too dangerous for novices. However, Jace responds that it was nothing after all, her master was very strong. The girl, still reluctant, says that the reward would be divided even further. Jace replies that her reward belonged to her master from that moment on. Right after, she calls for Yi as well. Time passes, and the scene shifts to the group of heroes in another location. Jace, confused, asks her companion where the monster was. But at that moment, the protagonist interferes. Right after, he draws his sword, asking them to be careful. At that moment, Jace's companion charges at Yi, landing a punch on him, which immediately breaks his sword. At that moment, Jace's companion was apparently summoning something, and then a gigantic spear appears. Jace quickly asks the girl to be careful. Right after, she pushes Xiaoyu, taking the full impact of the attack. A massive explosion occurs, and then an axe falls to the ground. Amidst the smoke, Jace was apparently very injured and a giant crater forms in that place. Meanwhile, Jace's former companion was observing everything, and at that moment, several magic swords appear. However, the girl easily manages to defend herself from all of them. Quickly, our hero charges even further, but none of those swords had worked, and right after the attack, the two end up colliding, and the girl with a threatening gaze begins to observe the protagonist. At that moment, that relic from before ends up appearing beside Yi, and the boy asks his companions to enter there and use the celestial talisman to save the other. Quickly, Xiaoyu accepts to do so. However, it was obvious that the other girl would not just let things be. At that moment, Yi steps back, surprised, saying that it was the unbreakable 7 stars matrix. Yang, meanwhile, seemed to be performing the incantation, and a magic circle appears beneath the protagonist. Yang says she would use the 1,000 spaces to provide support from the side. But right after, he places his hand on his sister's shoulder, telling her she should go to the sky of that ability and the suitor cabin, as there was a sword inside. Young said she would be back in a moment, and right after, she enters that relic. At that moment, our hero bites his finger, beginning to write something on that talisman, and that technique temporarily seals the ability, making entry impossible for everyone except its master. Then the scene shifts inside that place, and the seal, meanwhile, begins to appear in the sky of that location. Outside the talisman, Yi was still in battle. The other girl says that those tricks were useless. Yi asks if even she could say that, thinking that she was of sub-saint class, whose name was Axie, and that she had 5 realms more than him. For that reason, he had not been able to bring his constellation nor any sword to fight. Moreover, he had no chance against that person. However, if he could prevent her from entering that artifact, everyone would be safe, and in that situation, he was truly alone. Right after, he starts speaking, saying that she had not been surprised when she saw Jace in female form, asking what her purpose was. Then the girl removes her glasses, saying that it was thanks to the Lord's love that the child of the Almighty walked the world, and that the child of God was perfect, so much so that the masses sang his praises. The child of God's love was universal, so much so that the masses could partake in it. Then that girl seemingly begins to change forms, saying that the ignorant did not understand how to love the Almighty and worship him, venerate him always. And for that reason, they should love him in all ways. Thus, she would serve that person as a sacrifice. Introducing herself, the girl states that she was the papal knight, whose name was Iris, and that she could serve both as the dust at his feet and as his execution blade. Amidst that situation, Yi thinks that Jace's mother was right, because without her to hide the sacred aura, her presence really would have vanished. At that moment, the saint asked the protagonist to listen, stating that he should hand over that flaming sword from before. Thus, afterward, he would answer for his blasphemy against the Almighty and the child of God. Right after, the scene shifts inside the artifact. Jace, meanwhile, was being healed with some talismans. Shoyu was overseeing everything to help the girl, who apparently was very exhausted, thinking that it should be enough to save her life at that moment, and that when that idiot returned, he would need to give her several elixirs to restore her and heal her skin along with her bones. However, her strength base was almost completely erased due to her multiple injuries, wondering how she would react from that moment on. Moreover, all of this was happening only because Jace had saved her. At that moment, she begins to think of something, supposing that she should let Jace follow the path of immortal cultivation from that moment on. But if that were the case, she would truly become her master's wife. At that moment, Xiaoyu seemingly begins to feel something, coughing up a bit of blood, wondering if it was really so complicated for the power of the consecration realm to save someone in that manner. Right after, the ground begins to tremble. Xiaoyu asks what is happening with the ceiling of the grotto. Right after, she notices that talisman above. At that moment, the scene shifts to Yun, who was apparently trying to open the talisman, stating that it was a life talisman, and for that reason, it was terrible, because after all, she was not able to open it. Right after, the girl exerts a lot of effort, but even so, it was not enough, because she was definitely unable to open it. Once again, the scene shifts to Yi fighting against that saint, who then says she had to admit that his outfit satisfied all of her tastes, asking if attacking innocence was part of Holy Faith style. The girl then responds that, as she carried divine justice, the ends justified the means. He asks if that was true, because everything was for his perfect child of God, and for the child of all God's love, asking if she wasn't disgusted with herself. Right after, the saint becomes very irritated, asking if he dared to insult the child of God. With a threatening look, he asks if she was going to cry and beg. Meanwhile, the girl seems very irritated, stating that the knight Iris was there to eliminate the blasphemer. At that moment, Yi begins chanting an incantation, asking if the girl thought she was scaring him, because she was an insignificant knight, but even so, she belonged to the Pope, stating that he had already met her boss before. Right after, he invokes the incantation, saying that she should receive his sword, unleashing an attack toward the girl, thinking that he was deliberately irritating her, and for that reason, his provocation was both proud and knave. Right after, she easily dodges the attack, thinking that those movements were exaggerated and ineffective, and for that reason, very simple to avoid. But at that moment, she ends up thinking that it had to be a trick up his sleeve. Right after, a red dagger flies toward the girl, which she also manages to dodge, asking if that strange thing could penetrate the defenses of sacred arts. But at that moment, the saint is very surprised, because that dagger had passed through her axe. But even so, it was not enough, because the saint managed to block that attack. Ye, observing the situation, says that the girl had good reflexes, and at that moment begins to fall to the ground. However, it is revealed that it was just a rag doll, and within seconds, the protagonist is behind her, saying that she had fallen into his trap, and for that reason, she was out of options, mentioning that a descendant of the 5 Poisons sect, whose name was Yuzo, had once worked hard to develop that strange poison. The toxicity of that poison was a secret, and the science behind it was unknown. However, its function was to make people lose their minds and the ability to think for some time. And the girl who created it believed that excessive use of the mind was the origin of human suffering. Only by ceasing to dwell and ponder would it be possible to escape the pain of the world. Thus, the descendant Murong ended up naming that poison Thoughtless Liberation. Then, one day, a thief had infiltrated the Five Poisons sect. He not only entered the forbidden area without authorization, but also stole that precious bottle of Thoughtless Liberation. Thus, the thief disrespectfully renamed the item after discovering the function of that remedy, and ended up calling it Dumbifying Water. Returning to the present, our hero opens that jar, saying that the potion created by Yuzo could dumbify any earthly immortal for 3 days. And right after, he throws that substance at the saint. At that moment, our hero steps back, thinking that he should use that chance to clearly ask her what the hell was happening with the Holy See. Moreover, there was something else to consider, stating that he should study the design of the Holy See's clothing and learn the specialties to control the barbarians. Meanwhile, that saint was observing the liquid on her face and then begins to wipe it off. Observing everything, our hero seems very surprised, mentioning that the dumbifying water had been Yuzuo's greatest challenge. But even so, it had done nothing remarkable to that woman. At that moment, the saint begins to say something, stating that the child of God's universal affection was the reason she responded to the love of common people. For that reason, she should ensure that divine grace reached the innocent, who were endowed with supreme abilities. She could kill in that way and could be used to eliminate that state, whose name was Sacred Virgin Arts. Observing that, he seems very frustrated, thinking that that ability was the power of laws. At that moment, he begins another incantation, launching it toward the saint. As a consequence, a massive explosion occurs. However, that damn woman was still alive, but she seems surprised by something. Right after, he takes out a few more talismans, saying that at the very least, it was enough to have an exciting view. And right after, he bids farewell to the saint. At that moment, our hero disappears, and a massive darkness emerges. Meanwhile, Yi seemed to be in a very dark place, thinking that he had suffered a great financial loss because those talismans were very precious. However, as long as he could escape far enough, he would always be able to buy more. At that moment, Yi is very surprised. Right after, he seems to return to that forest, and looking to the side, he ends up encountering that saint. Surprised, he wonders if he had been caught, stating that he never had a chance from the beginning. For that reason, he was utterly in disbelief at what he was seeing. Right after, that girl says that the prayer she had learned from him had no escape. At that moment, a chain begins to reveal itself. Thus, it ends up binding itself to the protagonist's body, and the saint says that the Sacred Virgin Arts had 2 abilities. Right after, the scene shifts to Yi's talisman from before. Xiao Yu, along with Yun, seemed to be very out of breath, and beneath them, there were several talismans. Right after, the other girl says that Xiao Yu had exhausted herself by ascending in rank to rescue someone. For that reason, she should forget the risk of having her realm lowered, asking if she had damaged her soul foundation. Amidst that situation, Xiao Yu and Yun seemed very desperate, saying that there had to be a way, because they definitely had to do something. Yun says that the protagonist's realm was greater than theirs and that, for that reason, this outcome was expected, mentioning that they had used all their cards, but they couldn't break through the barrier, and all they could do now was wait. However, there was still one ability, which was through the combination of their powers, because that way at least they could see what was happening outside. Xiao Yu and Yun quickly agreed to it. At that moment, a light begins to emerge in that place, and a symbol appears on the foreheads of both sisters. Right after, they end up colliding their bodies into each other. A massive light begins to emerge, and a portal to the exit seemingly appears. However, Yun looks utterly horrified by what she was seeing, because she ends up encountering that saint from before, who meanwhile seemed to be holding someone. The scene cuts back to the Adventurers Guild. An unknown girl asks if the Queen's Knight Regiment had requested reinforcements. Meanwhile, the other guild members were very surprised, asking if a Knight of the Queen was really that beautiful. Hearing that, his 2 companions end up slapping the boy. The guild receptionist then says that the last request had been completed, but since she had gone through the trouble of coming there, they should prepare a guest room so she could rest. At that moment, that girl seems to notice something, and soon after, she disappears. She begins running swiftly through the city. The other guy says that she was heading toward the desert, wondering what that girl was. The scene cuts back to the battle, and the protagonist seemed to be in terrible condition. However, his opponent only had a scratch on her cheek. She says that he was quite strong, and even with a 5-class difference, he managed to wound her. And if not for his blasphemy, he might have been permitted to become a subordinate of the Almighty. Hearing that, our hero starts coughing, and the girl approaches to hear what he had to say. He then tells her to die along with her god. Hearing this, the girl becomes furious, saying that she had her own methods to discover what he was hiding, and because of that, he should disappear already. She throws her sword at the boy. However, that unknown person from before suddenly appears at the scene, managing to knock the saint's axe away. The protagonist, seeing that, is surprised because a white-haired girl was protecting him. The saint, meanwhile, seems to recognize that person. The girl, in turn, introduces herself, saying that she was Knight Snow, the Queen's Knight Regiment. The saint, seeing that, seems surprised because she was the unshakable swordswoman, the legendary knight who had risen through the ranks in just half a year. Ye, meanwhile, was thinking that Bei had been there for half a year, Xiaoyu had been there for 3 months, and it seemed like everyone's time was different. The saint says that she was in the middle of an execution and asks if this represented the position of her queen, asking if her majesty desired war against the Holy See. Snow says that she was acting on her own and that it did not involve her majesty. For that reason, she would not lay a finger on him. Recognizing the girl, the protagonist asks if, by any chance, she was Mubai. Hearing that, the girl is surprised, saying that she was not. Moreover, she did not know the boy. Ye, in turn, begins analyzing the girl, thinking that he could have miscalculated, but with that size and shape, there was no way he was wrong. Embarrassed, the girl asks him not to stare at her. He thinks that she speaks well with others, so he is impressed by her true personality. The girl says that if there was an enemy, they came first, and for that reason, he should let her engage. She charges toward the saint. Soon after, the two swords collide. Calling the girl Xiao Bei, the protagonist says that she could win, and for that reason, she should use the power of a dragon and teach her a lesson with the sword. He begins to give battle instructions, thinking that it was obvious she could handle it however she wanted. However, that swordplay was from his teachings, asking if it was unrecognizable. Meanwhile, the battle was still raging and Yi seems surprised, and soon after, that girl ends up hitting the protagonist, who falls onto her. Seeing that situation, the girl becomes embarrassed, asking if the boy was okay. He then responds that he was fine. Snow says that the battle axe is heavy and covers a wide area, and combining both powers with the laws made it difficult to deal with her. He asks if she was trying to cut the girl in half. Meanwhile, the protagonist had a bleeding nose. Thus, Snow grabs a cloth and begins to wipe the boy's nose, saying that she might not be Xiaobei, but even so, she had listened to him. Then she leaps forward again, charging at the saint. The battle continues while the protagonist watches everything in silence. The boy says that if things continued that way, she would end up being defeated. Hearing that, Snow remains silent, then looks at Yi again, who in turn grabs the girl's hair, saying that when the sword is standing, he also asks what the point of trying to cover it was. After everything that had happened, Yi had apparently begun to join the battle as well, asking why they wouldn't bring her out and show her the light, questioning if she thought he wouldn't recognize the sword he had given her. Then a new form emerges from that sword. Ye, in turn, takes the girl's hand and begins giving instructions, saying that the commander's sword was lethal, piercing the lungs and enraging ignorant men like a fallen corpse, asking if she still remembered which sword it was when he had taught her, that it was the commander's sword, or in other words, the sword of death. The boy then takes that sword again, saying that Mubai was from the Chunshan sword clan, and for that reason, she should follow his orders. The scene cuts back to that talisman again, and Yun, along with Xiaoyu, seem to be observing everything, apparently frustrated. Yun says that she didn't expect Sister Xiaoyu to recognize her, especially from that angle. The girl says that she preferred to say that if it weren't for that angle, she wouldn't have been able to tell. However, she also didn't expect that she would recognize her without even seeing her face. Yun says that that figure and form didn't need a face because there was no mistake. She was definitely Mubai. Meanwhile, Yun seemed very frustrated, saying that it was very shameless of Xiaoyu, asking if she secretly watched those things. Xiaoyu asks if it wasn't Yun who was always worried about being their brother's favorite because she seemed to be losing confidence. Then the two begin arguing. Yun, meanwhile, was thinking that it didn't make sense because her brother suddenly changed his preferences, because Yi had liked the upper part since childhood, and for that reason, she wanted to know why he had changed now. Meanwhile, Xiaoyu was thinking the same thing and clearly remembered that his reaction was better when he saw her changing socks that one time. And thinking back to the last time during their triple cultivation, his favorite part wasn't the upper one. Supposing that the boy had really changed his tastes now. Right after, the two begin analyzing the lower parts, thinking that they weren't losing in any way. The scene cuts back to the battle, and all the swords seem to be broken. That saint, meanwhile, was kneeling on the ground in tears, saying that they were strong just as she had thought. He says that she overestimates him too much, but even so, she should be grateful for it. The saint says that he obviously had a strong killing intent and attacked her with countless flying swords. Knowing the sacred arts to protect herself, she chose to aim at the weapon, which was a smart move on her part. The protagonist says that it was nothing more than a small sword formation, called the Repaired Draconic Slaughter Sword Matrix. Hearing that name, the woman is very surprised. He says that his master created that formation and improved it twice. The sacred arts could not escape from it, much less an earthly immortal. Some time ago, there was a girl who deceived a man when she used a matrix against the one who had taught her swordsmanship. And a deceived and destroyed master was truly a depressing sight, asking what Xiao Bai thought of that. A flashback appears of when she was defeating Yi, and the girl says that she knew nothing. Meanwhile, the saint seemed very irritated, calling the boy an outsider. He asked her not to get excited because she had interrogated him before, and now he was simply doing the same, asking what she knew about the Holy See. Right after, the saint remains silent, realizing she had no way out and ends up grabbing the sword in front of her. He says that she had no chance of winning, and even so, she wished for death. The saint uses that sword on herself, ending her own life, saying that he was absolutely right because she had wished to do that. Yi, Surprised, it says that she was his sword right in front of him, and this was absolutely insane. Snow, confused, asks what they should do because that girl was about to die. The protagonist asks her to be careful. However, the saint says that it was already too late because all eyes were on that city, and it was as if the child of God had come in person. At that moment, a beam of light appears. Snow asks what the girl had done. Right after, that symbol on her forehead disappears, and the girl says that she had definitely been defeated. However, they shouldn't celebrate too soon because things would only get worse from now on. The scene once again cuts to that White Hall. Ye, meanwhile, seemed to be very injured, saying they never imagined they would reunite so soon. That goddess from before said that he had become very weak and boring, and Immortal was no different from an Anicap. He said that he simply couldn't judge his best today, but he should just wait because sooner or later his sword would show its other half. The goddess said that the last ability had power that made her feel something familiar, but it was still very weak. Right after, that goddess seemed surprised, saying it was interesting that there were more people, and if by chance someone was spying on him. Then she began using an ability, starting to observe inside that talisman. Thus, the other two girls ended up being caught, and that magic circle was destroyed. Right after, the protagonist came out of a portal. Snow, seeing this, said that he was hurt and terribly wounded. Yi then handed the talisman to the girl, asking her to run, but right after, another person appeared in that portal. Snow quickly used that talisman, which disappeared in a matter of seconds. That goddess from before ended up emerging from the portal, appearing before that saint. The saint quickly began to approach the goddess, saying that she was personally there, sincerely apologizing for not completing the mission that had been entrusted to her, and for that reason, she should be punished. Right after, the saint seemed surprised because in a matter of seconds, she was already in a completely different place. The saint thought that praise or punishment would serve no purpose, and in the eyes of the daughter of the Almighty, she was a tool she would never cross paths with. Besides, that consideration should be out of love. Meanwhile, that goddess was silent and said that, as expected, it was them. Right after, the scene was cut to Yi's house. At the same instant, that Snow, along with the protagonist, ended up appearing in that place. Quickly, the girl placed the MC in a more comfortable corner, and after some time, dried all his wounds. Then she took a sacred medicine, and at the same instant, she ended up ingesting it, placing that liquid in the boy's mouth, which immediately seemed to regain consciousness. However, he was still very injured. A flashback of the Hyundai continent appeared. Yi said that what he could still teach her on the path of the sword wasn't much, asking if she should learn something else. She had so many abilities, but nothing oppressive, wondering if maybe some healing or support skills would be useful. However, the girl replied that she didn't want that. He asked what she would do when she got hurt, but the girl said that her brother would save her. Hearing that, the protagonist was surprised, and soon after, he stroked the girl's head. The scene then cut back to the present, and Snow seemed to be drying the boy's wounds with tears on her face. However, determined, she thought she had to do it, and thus she refocused. At that moment, she placed a bit of aura on her fingers, directing that enchantment to her wrist, managing to draw some blood. It dripped into the protagonist's mouth, and a power seemed to have been transferred to him. Snow, in turn, placed her wrist in the boy's mouth, which he then began to suck. As time passed, the girl started observing the protagonist in silence. At that moment, he suddenly opened his eyes, and that mark on his chest began to glow. Yi immediately grabbed the girl and threw her to the ground, and Snow ended up punching the boy, making him fall. The girl started observing the protagonist, who seemed dazed, but even so, he did not regret what he had done. The scene then cut to the place where the battle had happened. An unknown girl said that it hadn't gone badly, and that once again, she had made progress, and that on her only path through the way of the sword, she wouldn't be far from that person. Finishing her training, she said that was all for today. Even with her incredible talents, she wondered if she wouldn't follow through to train in combat. However, the girl ended up replying that she wouldn't. The other said that was terrible, but she should be aware that sometimes using the sword had its own disadvantages, and for that reason, she would teach a single martial arts style that fought using fists. Right after, she took the girl's hand, starting to give instructions, showing her how that technique worked. The girl said she was just instructing her about the fists, and therefore she shouldn't think too much about it. The scene then cut back to the present, with Snow remembering everything that had happened, where she began to execute it. She then started delivering multiple punches to the boy's face, who soon after seemed to fall unconscious again. Snow then places the boy back on the bed again. As time passes, night finally falls. Yi, who was sleeping during this time, suddenly regains consciousness. Confused, the boy starts looking around. Then he cast an enchantment, realizing that his injury was almost healed, wondering what kind of power was inside his body. He had never seen that kind of power before, so it must have been the blood of a rare animal. And now that they were safe, they should discuss those things with Xiaoyu and Yun. Thus, the protagonist summons that talisman, beginning to break the seal that was previously there. Without wasting time, the two of them emerge from the enchantment. The protagonist, happy, says that it had been a long time since he last saw them. But right after, Xiaoyu ends up slapping the boy across the face. With tears on her face, she seems very sad. Noticing the situation, he tries to explain himself. However, Xiaoyu hugs the boy. Yi says that now he understands why in the future he wouldn't do anything like that again. Meanwhile, Yun is watching in silence and then approaches Yi. Surprisingly, she confronts him up close, and when she finishes, she walks away saying that she has finally removed the good energy from her brother. And because of that, she was practically starving. Besides, he might have fooled her, but the whole time she knew that her brother was the strongest. So that battle wasn't really a big deal. Right after, Yi takes the girl's hand. Thus, the three of them demonstrate great affection. Time passes, and the three seem to be sitting on the bed. Yun mentions that something has been on her mind the whole time, and the protagonist asks what the problem is. The girl says that her brother described his sword inside the sky of the grotto, asking if that was a real thing. Yi says no, explaining that he had spoken nonsense to fool them at that time, and that all his swords are stored in that storage box. Xiaoyu says she thought that most of them couldn't be taken out due to the heavenly realm. The protagonist says that she could defeat a person, but she shouldn't aim at their face. Changing the subject, Yun asks what was inside the sky of the grotto. Our hero responds that it was nothing much, just some old texts. One of those that weren't very relevant. Right after, Yun pulls out a magazine, asking if it was like that. Observing the magazine, the protagonist is surprised because she had taken it from the sky of the grotto. Yun says that being trapped made Xiaoyu and her anxious, so they spent all their time in the sky of the grotto, and thus they ended up going through those old texts as well. Besides, they had also read that other type of text. Then another book is presented to the boy. Embarrassed, the protagonist asks them not to look at those writings. At that moment, the two girls become very irritated, saying that they never thought the boy would look at those kinds of things normally. Embarrassed, he says that they were rummaging through the sky of the grotto and still daring to scold him. And because of that, he had to punish them in some way. But at that moment, someone knocks on the door, stopping the whole process that Yun was about to carry out. The three of them, looking at the door, seem surprised because Snow had simply appeared in that place. Without wasting time, the protagonist asks everyone to listen. Snow, meanwhile, remains silent. Then she clenches her fist. At the same moment, Xiao and Yun, along with Yun, do the same. However, Yi intervenes in that situation, saying that before they continued beating him, he had just one question, asking if her fighting fist technique had come directly from Feihong's teachings. At that moment, Yun remembers everything she had learned from Feihong before. And the same thing happens with Xiaoyu. Noticing that the girls had responded, the protagonist says that it seemed he was right, and for that reason, they should punch him without any mercy. Time passes again. The boy now seemed very injured, saying that he really wasn't joking around. And just now, Mobile had said that it was his dragon blood that had saved him. From now on, that strange blood was in his entire body, along with the innate sword constitution. Xiao and Yu say that Mobile was also born with an innate sword constitution, so his blood naturally favored the sword constitution in his body. And Yun says that the blood entered his body while he was in a coma. Therefore, without deliberately guiding it, the dragon's blood integrated into the innate sword constitution. He says that she was right, and as a consequence, his internal constitution was now unbalanced. Hearing that, Mobile is surprised, saying that he had hurt his brother. But Xiaoyu says that there was no other choice at that time, and because of that, the girl did well. He says that it wasn't such a big deal, and as long as he wasn't defeated again, he could feel the strange blood burning with every attack. Xiaoyu, along with Yun, are very surprised, asking if that meant they could no longer hit the protagonist. Hyun Tong responds that he didn't simply mean that, at least for now, because there was nothing stopping him. After all, there was never anything wrong with a little fighting in a marriage. Xiaoyu, irritated, asks who is calling a wife, saying that he was a shameless person and asking if Snow and Yun didn't agree with that. However, the two girls remain silent, leaving Xiaoyu very irritated, saying that Yi should just keep talking. The boy says that, to summarize everything, he needed to stabilize the pair again or else he would either dragonize or explode and perish. Hearing that, the girls are very surprised, thinking about the possibility of Yi turning into a dragon, which could definitely be a bit interesting. However, Yi says that he didn't want to become that, and besides, it was more likely that he would end up being killed and having an explosive death. Xiaoyu asks what the solution to this problem was. Thus, the boy, along with Yun, says that it was cultivation with 4 people because he still needed to break things seriously. That way, the balance of constitutions along with their cores should reach an identical level, and so he could continue to improve more and more. Xiaoyu asks why the development sounded so familiar, questioning if he wasn't saying that he was trying to trick them again with his cultivation bases. The protagonist says that it wasn't that and that she should check the state of her spiritual veins. Hearing this, the girl falls silent, eventually accepting it, stating that if there was no other choice, she would do it. Yun says that if it was cultivation with 4 people, her brother would either dragonize or explode and perish. Besides, against their greatest enemy, who was the son of God, they wouldn't know when he would actually appear again. And logically, the only way was to do this. However, Xiaoyu says that Yi's way of thinking about it was deceptive, since he hadn't even compensated for the old cultivation bases he had taken before. And because of that, he should return them immediately. Right after, Snow says that she was willing to do the cultivation because, if it was necessary to save her brother, she would do it anyway. Yun places a hand on the girl's shoulder, saying that she was too young, and that her cultivation base was being refined by a certain mortal master, And because of that, if she cultivated, she would never be able to recover her aura again. Xiao Yu says that she didn't want to forget when they lent him their nascent souls. Yun says that years and years of cultivation on the path of the sword could suddenly disappear because of that type of cultivation. And that was what had happened to her other sisters. Hearing what her sisters had said, Snow is very surprised and starts observing the protagonist. But even so, the girl seemed determined, saying that there was still a path for this. He asks if she had any other alternative. Xiaobai says that they should just let him face an explosive death. Then they would take his remaining soul to the profound sword of the immortal dragon to be cultivated for 5,000 years. Hearing this, all three are very surprised, and Yun says that there was really no need for that. Meanwhile, the protagonist is on the ground in tears, realizing that he didn't seem to have much of a choice. Yun and Xiao Yu are observing all the cultivation, asking what other choice he had, because if he died from the explosion, they would never be able to return with their nascent souls. Then Yun whispers into the girl's ear, who seems very surprised. Xiao Yu then picks up a brush, where she apparently starts writing something. Beside her, Yun is doing the same thing. On that text, it was written that the protagonist owed the two girls a nascent soul from the cultivation base of consecration, and if he refused to pay, he would face divine punishment with no resurrections. And Xiao Yu says that he had to sign that text so they could share their cultivation bases. Only then could he consider doing it. Ye, in turn, says that without a doubt, he could sign it. Yun tells him to hurry up and sign it before her sister changes her mind. He picks up the pen and starts analyzing the conditions in the text, where one of the conditions was that he must love the girls for all eternity. Xiao Yu, seeing that, remains silent. Irritated, she asks Yun what kind of condition she had placed in the text. Time then passes and the signature has already been made. Yun then seems to prepare the bed, throwing some roses. Xiao Yu asks him to wait because he was getting too excited. Yun asks if they should cultivate or not since she had already waited long enough. She asks if Xiao Yu is opposing it because she doesn't want to transfer her cultivation base to her brother, questioning whether he was really going to go through with it or not. Having no other choice, the girl ends up accepting. Time passes again, and Xiao Yu tells Xiao Ba not to be too anxious because what they were about to do was not difficult. The only thing they had to do was follow the protagonist. Yun says that this was the first time Xiao Ba was witnessing the pearl diving, so she shouldn't be hasty and should be guided slowly through each step. Thus, the three seem to be prepared for cultivation, asking Yi to instruct them. Time passes and Yi's spirit appears. Happy, he says that it had been a long time since he had seen the girls. Besides, he was welcoming Xiaoba to her first meeting. Yun says that as she could see, that was Yi's spirit, the brother who was generated through the pearl diving. The girl then begins to analyze that spirit, which then starts whispering in Xiao Yu's ear. She then asks why it was so small. Yun says that she shouldn't be impatient because that newborn body was quite wonderful and had many different forms. So she should leave it to her sister, who would teach her a technique that could increase it more and more. To begin by restraining their breathing without discarding the window, they should start by doing that. And applying modern pressure to stimulate the spiritual pathways improve the process. And in a matter of seconds, that spirit starts growing more and more. Meanwhile, Xiao Yu was observing her key weapon. Yun asks if Xiao Ba was seeing that because they had finished their computation, and now her brother's spirit was very large. Xiao Ba, meanwhile, was observing in surprise, and right after, she grabs the boy's spirit. The other two, worried, ask Xiao Ba to calm down because she might end up messing up the cultivation. Xiao Ba says that handle was convenient for the sword. Meanwhile, the spirit seemed very confused, asking what the girl was talking about, saying that she should be responsible for saying this because that was not a sword handle, and she absolutely couldn't extract a sword from there. However, Xiaoba seemed determined to do it anyway, and right after, she starts shaking that spirit, and then something strange ends up happening. Time passes, and the three seem to be wiping their faces. Yun says that she was trying to say that the sword could not be extracted and only other things would be released. Xiao Yu says that he might be crying from pain, but she never imagined he would get excited over something like that. Meanwhile, the spirit was still recovering. Xiao Yu tells her to forget about it because she was going to start personally. The body born in Yang's spirit mind was no different from the true body, and the opening in the neck, which was the intelligence core of the focal point, was the concentration of Kai. Meanwhile, Yun was very surprised, thinking that her sister was normally shy but was now very active at a critical moment, and for that reason she couldn't lose to her. Right after, the girl ends up jumping, saying that Xiaobai should take a look, saying that they could be immortal cultivators and even those who ascended in the light of day had once walked through darkness in the yellow areas. Therefore, it wasn't all about the lower parts, and she should make sure to put her face into action as well. Xiaobai, meanwhile, was watching everything in silence. Xiao Yu asks if the girl understands, and if by chance she wanted to try as well. Thus, Xiaobai ends up starting to do the same, beginning to observe that spirit. Xiao Yu says that she was blocking and choosing the easy path. Xiaobai starts getting closer to the spirit, and Yu tells her to continue, but with a little more calmness. Meanwhile, the spirit seemed very happy. And then the girl decides to talk to the spirit more closely. Xiao Yu, meanwhile, was watching everything confused. Then the protagonist starts screaming. As Xiao Bai gets off the bed, the other two immediately begin using a healing talisman to improve the boy's condition. The protagonist then grabs Xiao Bai again. Bringing her back to him, he asks if she was trying to run away after biting someone. But even so, it didn't matter because, in truth, he was even more excited. Right after, Yun ends up grabbing Xiao Yu's hair, doing the same with Yun, who, surprise, says that her brother and Xiao Bai managed to use the draconic physique in their cultivation, making it a spectacle. Right after, the girl begins to approach the other two, saying that she would try to get involved. Meanwhile, Xiao Yu was closely watching everything. She also seemed to want to cultivate. The girl says that involving that type of cultivation with dragons and demons was very incomplete, and understanding those beings required first cultivating both the Tao and the human form. And since there was no other human in that place, a little research would be necessary, and in any case, she should also participate in it. Time passes again, and Yun finally appears. Yuan, in turn, seems to have woken up. Then she unequips her invisible armor and puts on the visible one. Looking to the side, she sees the three girls and then opens the door. Looking up, she begins to observe the sky. At that moment, she starts flying upwards, saying that she was at the peak of the nascent soul realm, and now she was a short sword. The scene then cuts back to their house. All three of them seem to have woken up. Right after, they hear a voice from outside the window. Xiao Bai immediately comes across a blue sword. She tries to grab it, saying that Yuan had clearly said before that it was a gift for her. The protagonist says that he was just borrowing it, so he would return it later. Thus, he ends up taking it away again. Xiao Bai, irritated, starts crying, saying that she wanted her sword. Xiao Yu says that it was okay because they would just make him lend it and then return it later. Yuan says that there was nothing to fear because the sword box contained many immortal swords inside. Hearing that, Xiao Bai becomes very happy, saying that she wanted to know where that place was. The scene then cuts to the protagonist, who in the meantime seemed to be in the sky, enjoying the breeze. That sword appears and Yuan ends up grabbing it. Starting to observe it, he performs several strikes to test it. The scene then cuts to another location, where several statues of that goddess from before seem to be in a sanctuary. Meanwhile, a girl in that place seems to be smiling. It was said last time that the protagonist's state, along with all those who practice pearl diving, was now balanced. Mobai improved the way he dove with the sword, a completely new and unknown field. And Yuan was teaching that girl, guiding her through all the steps. The one who had taken the initiative was Xiao Yu. Thus, all three had been able to cultivate alongside the protagonist. After cultivation, the protagonist had gone through a selection. And what he ended up facing was this. That guy had been terribly defeated not long ago, but now he was already in a good mood. And because of that, you couldn't help but play around with that guy, because you really wanted to defeat him again. Then a person places a hand on the goddess's shoulder. She then says that she did not desire that. The goddess says that she really placed her hand on her and asks if she wasn't worried about her life. The girl says that it wouldn't take long to stop that person, so she shouldn't worry. The goddess says that she was infiltrating her sanctuary and speaking comforting words, asking if that wasn't irrational. In response, the girl simply gives a smile. The goddess says that if she wasn't leaving, it was fine. The other girl questions why she didn't send another avatar as a mere token. However, the goddess says that she wasn't sending more experience because she was going to do something else. The scene then cuts back to Yi's house. Xiao Bai was equipping herself but worried, asks if her brother was okay. Yun says that with his 3 cultivation bases combined, her brother wouldn't even be at the peak of the nascent soul realm, so they should just stay there waiting for him. Xiao Bai asks if she doesn't remember the last time they caught the attention of the god of gods. Yun says that there were rumors that the son of God was at the peak of the earth immortal realm, and that while his projection might be smaller than his actual self, her brother had still easily killed him. And this time, the boy was much stronger, and he definitely wouldn't be defeated. However, Xiao Bai asks what would happen if that person arrived there personally. Xiao Bai then asks how long she had been carrying a sword in the nascent soul realm. Once again, the scene cuts to Yi, who was still in the sky. Time passes again, and night falls. However, the protagonist still had not come down as he remained there until the day appeared. Yi says that he had been negligent, wondering if the killing intent of that sword had accumulated for too long. They say there was a kind of hidden sword intent within the sheath containing an inner intent of assassination. Once, there were 2 people on the continent who went there and through a sword intent could kill an earth immortal with just a nascent soul. The first was called Luxi, and the other boy had no idea of the name, thinking that if that sword intent kept building up today, it could very well backfire. And because of that, you should check if there were any evil beings in that place. Once again, the scene cuts to Yi's house, and meanwhile, Yun seemed to be watching from the window. She is very surprised by what she sees as the protagonist appears with some kind of monster on his back. Xiao Yu asks if that was the son of God. Yi says that was exactly it, but it was always changing and taking on various forms. Yun says that it was not the son of God, but the Fire Barreto Lord, a demon class from the extreme eastern region, a half step into the earth immortal realm. That being that committed all kinds of evil, was cruel, and every year the northernmost provinces sacrificed countless troops to repel the aggression of its army. Hearing all that explanation, the protagonist is confused, saying that those crazy leaders wanted Yi to marry their daughters, but he had refused all of them. Xiao Yu says that he looked like an all-powerful mortal master, killing and exorcising demons while even rejecting beautiful deities. The protagonist says that he had refused all those people because of them. Meanwhile, Xiaobai seems very irritated, demanding that he return what belonged to her. Yi, on the other hand, seems very confused. Xiaobai asks him to return the profound dragon sword. And the boy says that after killing the deep dragon demon, that sword had become bound to him. Hearing that, Xiaobai starts crying. The protagonist says that the sword was not breaking or anything like that. It was just inside his body, so she should just retrieve the sword. Xiaobai does so, but still ends up punching the boy. The scene then cuts to another location, and Yi asks what happened to Jace. Xiao Yu says that she was fine, but her power was depleted to the point that she had practically become an ordinary person. Yun says that her nature was not bad, along with her physique. And because of that, she should accept her into the Mixuan sect to receive instruction in the way of immortal cultivation. However, Yi says that they should listen to the girl's own thoughts first. Right after, he releases her from his talisman. At that moment, she seems to have returned from an era of training. Looking around, she realizes that she had already returned to the real world. She quickly rushes to hug the protagonist. Looking to the side, she sees Xiao Yu and hugs her as well. Then she does the same with Yun, saying that she might have lost part of her strength, but her wounds were healed and she was practicing the combat techniques left by her wives. Ye, meanwhile, seems confused about what the girl was talking about. Xiao Yu says that the predominant fist technique could help establish a solid foundation for immortal cultivation. Yun then asks about the mental technique, and Jace says that it was the pearl diving technique which her wife had said she could use in the future. Hearing that, Xiao Yu becomes irritated and starts chasing after Jace. The girl then looks to the side and comes across Xiaobai asking who she was. Without wasting time, Xiaobai moves next to Yi, who then says that she was his master and that it was she who should be asking that question. Seeing that, Jace is surprised, seeming to realize something. Shortly after, she moves towards Xiaobai, calling her sister. Time passes and Yun says that everything had been resolved, and because of that, it was time for their cultivation bases to be returned once and for all. Xiaoyu then asks to wait because even though she wanted her cultivation base back so badly, her body still needed to recover. And Xiaobai was also not in the best condition. Hearing that, Yun is disappointed, saying that this group was too fragile, and for that reason, she would recover her cultivation base first, on her own. The two then become very irritated, saying that she couldn't do that. Meanwhile, Jace was observing everything, saying that maybe she didn't know what they were doing, but even so, she should take the initiative and join in. She then starts getting involved in the middle of that discussion. At that moment, an unknown person suddenly kicks open the door of Yi's house, saying that the chief's base had detected Xiaobai, and for that reason, they had come to rescue her. However, the girl seems to change her mind as soon as she sees what is happening. Right after, another person appears asking what she was doing, saying that it didn't matter who dared to touch Xiaobai as they were there to save her. Soon after, that same girl also seems to change her mind instantly, and then another member appears at the scene, experiencing the same thing that had happened to the other two. Thus, it finally becomes clear what was happening in that place, because all three seem to be clinging to the protagonist, who says that it was really interesting. Another girl, embarrassed, starts observing what was happening, asking what they were doing. Yi, still covering his face with divine protection, says that it wasn't what it looked like and that it was all a misunderstanding. Then he asks the other four to wait a moment, asking who those people inside his house were. The scene then cuts to outside Yi's house, and the protagonist asks if that short girl was a princess, who then confirms, saying that Xiaobai was her favorite ice knight, and for that reason, he should return her or else he would be arrested. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.